Hello, everyone, and welcome to Through Time and Clades. My name is Joan,
And I'm Albert.
and we have reached. This is it, folks. This is the penultimate episode of Humanity a
Oh,
Prologue.
damn.
Yeah, we're in part 12, City Slickers. But before we jump in, how are things with you, Albert?
Pretty good. I actually have a few things to report this week regarding kind of relevant things to mention
Ooh,
regarding my
yeah.
status. Yeah. So I guess first of all is that Katrina Van Grau's fundraiser to attend her PhD. Um, that we mentioned in the last episode, that is our news episode for this month, it has reached its target, which was,
Woo!
yeah, which is really fast. So I think thanks in large part to a very generous donation. Um, but in any case, yes. So that has been reached, and many thanks to everybody who helped out. Um, so that's some pretty good news. Um, let's
Great.
see. Absolutely. And let me think, what else did I have to mention? Ah, yes. So something I've worked on has come out. So that was another project I worked on with the German educational studio Kurzgesagt. They do these really artistic and interesting videos, kind of discussing various topics. And most recently, they have released a video about the end Cretaceous mass extinction. I didn't have a whole lot of input on the video, but they did ask for my advice on a few things related to the dinosaurs, and so some of those did make it into the final version. So I was very happy to see that. But I did have a kind of a greater contribution to a new poster that they have released in their online shop. So they have released a poster depicting a selection of kind of dinosaurs that were alive at the time of the end Cretaceous mass extinction. So the dinosaurs that were actually wiped out by the extinction. Um, they don't include avialan dinosaurs, so dinosaurs that are very closely related to birds, but they do include, like, quote unquote classic, many of the classic dinosaurs that were alive at the time, like Tyrannosaurus Rex and Triceratops and all of that. And I did have a fair bit more input on that product. Basically, I looked over several versions of this poster and gave them various corrections or recommendations regarding the information they put on there, as well as the designs of the dinosaurs themselves. So I'm quite happy with how that one turned out, because they really did go to quite a lot of trouble to incorporate all the things I suggested. So yeah, I think much like my previous experience with them working on the poster depicting the tree of life, it was a very positive experience. So I'm glad those things are out. Um, and what else? Right. So technically, I am currently attending a conference right now. Well, not like at this very moment, but in this time period. Um, so there is a conference going on, currently still online as things are at the moment. Um, Called Progressive Paleontology, and this is a conference that's usually held in the UK here. And what is special about it is that it is run by students, and specifically for students. It is also completely free of any kind of attendance fees or anything, so very affordable to the target audience. And it is a really lovely little conference, because of the fact that it is attended primarily by students. It is a very kind of laid back atmosphere. It's a really nice kind of environment to get to know your peers and what they're working on, and present your work without too much pressure of being judged by kind of people with more vastly more experience or authority. So it's really nice. I am not presenting anything this year because I am finishing up my PhD, and I really didn't really have time to put together a presentation, so I decided not to this year. Um, it is kind of surreal because very soon I think I would no longer be in the target audience for ProgPow, and I've been attending it for every chance I got for the past few years since I was a master's
Yeah.
student. It is it makes me feel old, I guess. Like maybe not physically old, but definitely academically old. That I'm kind of one of the older, more longer term students that are at the conference, and seeing how kind of up and comers are what they're working on. It's I don't know. But yeah, because I've also been trying to finish my PhD, I haven't been as involved as in like actually attending presentations and stuff. But I've caught a few snippets of here and there, and everything looks really cool. It's really great to see what everybody's working on. So if anyone out there is a paleontology student, I highly recommend that you attend ProgPal if you get the chance. Of course, normally when it's an in-person conference, it's only held in the UK, so it might be a bit hard for people from other places to get to. But this year it is online, so we actually do get quite a global representation of people coming from far and wide. Um, so who knows? Maybe in the future they'll continue having an online component, and then if that's the case, maybe it'll remain accessible to a wide audience. But we'll see. But in any case, if you are in the UK, I do strongly recommend that you attend if you are a student. It's essentially intended for pretty much anyone working in paleo who is not who does not have a PhD degree. So um, it's a really you hospitable and accessible environment. I like it a lot. Okay, I think my final update is I finally got my first shot of the COVID vaccine. Hooray! Uh,
Excellent.
yeah, I know it's been kind of a long time coming, but kind of the way things have been rolling out here in the UK is that they kind of went age group by age group, and it took a while for them to get to people under 30s like myself. So uh, so yeah, it's been a while, but yeah, I finally got it. So far, I'm feeling pretty all right. Nothing too out of the ordinary. Like my arm is sore because I got it just yesterday. Um, but it's nothing to worry about so far. So that's all been good. All right. Yeah, I think those will do for my updates, which went on for a lot longer than usual. How about you?
No, it's all good. I mean, there is not a lot to report on my end. All your updates are really exciting. I am still in Florida, but because the past week has been nothing but gray clouds and rain, with I guess a Saharan dust storm that we're supposed to be
Whoa.
getting, but I haven't seen heads or tails of that. Probably because of all the clouds and stuff. We've mostly been indoors, um, but I am well. I guess the biggest thing is, as far as pop culture is concerned,
Hmm.
I'm mentally preparing myself for the next 12 months or so as Jurassic World
Oh.
Dominion news starts coming in. Yeah, it's I always tell myself that I don't want to get too involved in discourse,
Hmm.
and these are popcorn movies that are with their own plot holes and whatnot, and I've just they don't grab my attention, and then like stuff comes out and it grabs my attention. 'Cause, they had just released a screenshot and some posters,
Hmm.
and I guess a couple like images as well that are previewing. Because I guess what's going on is for the Fast and Furious movie, if you get your tickets for like the IMAX screening or whatever, um, they're going to show like a 6 minute preview
Right.
or like clip from the new Jurassic World, and it's a big deal because like they are essentially showing like the backstory to everything. It's the late Cretaceous period, and the dinosaurs are doing their dinosaur things out in the wild, and it's all beautiful and naturey. And then it fast forwards to the present day, where it's a dinosaur world again because all the animals have escaped and they're terrorizing people and whatnot. And this has brought a lot of excitement to people because like this all basically started with a tweet from Colin Trevorrow, the director, as kind of a callback to his like earlier tweet when Jurassic World was first coming out, showing a feathered dinosaur. And so like they're saying like, oh well, we want to show like real dinosaurs. So this in this behind the scenes, back in time preview, they're going to be feathered, and the T-Rex is going to have feathers, and it's going to be all wonderful. Um, and then of course they started like showing like little clips of like the T-Rex with feathers, and of course discourse ensues because it looks like they just took the Rexy model and gave it like a fuzz
Mm.
around its body, and people are like, you can't just do that. There's still more anatomical stuff, and yin and yin, and just uh I it's a lot.
Yeah.
I don't know whether I should get involved in any of this or not, or if I should just like stay in the background and just watch as all this plays out. Um, because I mean, yeah, Jurassic World is a popular franchise. It's like one of the few nostalgic things that have come out in the past few years that actually seems to have stuck,
Mm.
which is saying something because they rebooted all kinds of classic properties only for them to fade into obscurity.
Right.
And like this is the one that managed to work. I mean, because people like dinosaurs. Dinosaurs are cool. I mean, we talk about them a lot because we
Yeah.
think they're cool and they're fascinating, and we have our own histories with them.
Mm.
Um, I don't know, Albert. What do you think of all this?
Yeah, I am really tired of Jurassic World discourse, and I got tired of it a long time ago. So yeah, I don't think I'll likely actually get involved in it very much. Like I've been kind of following the news just to be aware of it because of course it is a major pop cultural phenomenon. I do think it is vaguely interesting that they finally decided to put feathered dinosaurs in there, but yeah, I don't know. I think I'll uh, I want to say I'll reserve judgment for the final product, but I'm not even sure if I will watch it. Like, I haven't watched the last one, for example, um,
Mm.
because I'm so tired of just everything surrounding it. So, um, yeah, I guess. So I guess I don't really have much to say except to say that yeah I know it's a thing and I can see why there are a lot of people getting riled up about it, um, but I don't really plan on getting too involved in it myself.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you there. I did see the last film, but only because Mom wanted to see it.
Right, right,
She loves the Jurassic Park movies, and for her, like this is like the best thing ever. And
right.
it's a chance to bond, and
Yeah, of
I,
course.
I can say I've seen it, and I can kind of see where some people are coming from as far as like the ridiculousness of the plot. But again, like it's like a casual response. I'm not about to like break down scenes and motivation of characters that I've only like just been introduced to, so I don't really care about all that much.
Right, right.
Like unlike like the previous trilogy, which I did grow up with, and am very fond of.
Hmm.
I'll always sit down to watch the first three Jurassic Park
Hmm.
movies. And even the third one, which everybody seems to dislike, but
Right.
that's the one that I grew up with, which
Mm.
is that's its own funny story.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's definitely interesting that I guess the directors and the movie makers get to nerd out a little bit
Yeah.
because what's notable about this preview is that somewhat anachronistically they're showing a bunch of unique dinosaurs living in the same environment, including many new ones that have come out over the past couple of years.
Mm.
They're talking about, oh, we have Dreadnoughtus, and we're
Yes.
showing Moros intrepidus, which is like a little tiny tyrannosaurid.
Yeah,
Tyrannosaurid.
Tyrannosauroid. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So like part of the larger group of tyrannosaurs.
Right.
And it's like, oh, this is cool. And then of course they also have the rule of cool aspect in there because they're so I guess Rexy, who is the tyrannosaur, we get to see her origin story in the Cretaceous, and she fights a Giganotosaurus, dies. So that's gonna certainly rile up people. I mean, it's been what 2 decades, and people are still upset about the friggin' Spinosaurus.
Right. Right.
It just, you know, it'll certainly give us something to talk about in the next 12 months if we want
Mm-hmm,
to.
mm-hmm.
And I know I've debated whether we want to do like a Jurassic World special for the series. We will see. Nothing, no promises on that end.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think I'm definitely with you there. I'm just tired of it, and I would like to see more media with dinosaurs that is not clearly inspired by Jurassic World.
Yeah,
Because let's face it, I mean, for all the good that the Jurassic Park franchise has done for paleontology, as far as pop culture is concerned, it just touches anything to do with paleontology, and
right.
it's just a little frustrating.
Yeah, agreed. Agreed. Like, yeah, that pretty much is my stance on that issue. Yes, I think I really enjoyed the original Jurassic Park movie, the first one, and the next two sequels are fairly watchable to me. Um, but yeah, I agree. I think we need like fresh fresh presence of dinosaurs in popular culture now. I think it's time to let some other people have their own takes on it, and that aren't like completely either quote unquote so bad it's good movies or like blatantly targeted towards children. I guess. Um,
Definitely, definitely, I agree with you there. Um, but yeah, if anything, let's move on from
sure,
dinosaurs.
sure.
And we'll go a little bit forwards in time. Um, So today, we're dealing with the various societies around the world that developed urbanization. So cities, uh, bronze and iron technology, written languages, localized economies, and more, but not necessarily at the same time, the same place, or all at once, as we're going to see. So this is going to be quite a unique episode, I think, because we're going to toe the line between the prehistoric world of archaeologists and the written records of world historians. However, that doesn't mean that there was any one time that the world of prehistory like seamlessly turned into the world of history. That line is so blurred that if we want to be accurate, it doesn't really exist. To think of history as the moment when people were writing things down is to diminish and
Mm,
limit its potential.
mm.
Not to mention it limits who gets to be included in the story.
Oh yeah.
Because, yeah, many societies didn't keep written records. They transmitted information and stories orally
Hmm.
or other means. I mean, my goodness, how misleading and racist would it be to argue that Australian history only began in 1606?
Right,
That
right.
first line is there, because like humans have inhabited that landmass for like what 60,000 years.
Mm,
It's like no, no, history has to mean more than that, and it does, and it would do us all well to make world history properly global.
mm, mm,
So history, incidentally, is our understanding of the past and what we've learned through rigorous study. It's not the same thing as the past. What happened 1,000, 10,000, a million years ago, that's the past. It already happened. History is how we figure out just what happened and when, how, and why. This is one of the main points of this series that I've been trying to point out, to show that we've come to know about the human past, and we recognize that there's a lot that we still don't know, and so we're kind of piecing together this history of humanity bit by bit. Um, and for this episode, that understanding and knowledge improves vastly. Uh, I think it's safe to say that for all the mysteries of the ancient world, that of the Egyptians and the Greeks and the early Chinese dynasties, paleoanthropologists studying Pleistocene environments and peoples would go absolutely nuts if they had access to the sort of evidence that ancient historians get to work with.
oh yeah.
But the fact of the matter is, they don't. And that's not to say that ancient historians have it easy either. There are still enough mysteries, real mysteries, not alien garbage, to keep this field alive for generations to come.
Mm,
And we're going to take a look at just that. So let's get started.
alrighty.
And we'll go to the next slide. Um, just to kind of wrap up our coverage of the three ages of the Holocene, the Meghalayan encompasses the last 4,200 years. We owe the naming and definition of this time to a speleothem, or a mineral deposit, recovered from the Mamla cave in the state of Meghalaya in India. A cross section of this deposit was examined and given a golden spike at the 4.2 thousand year mark, which is directly linked to a global climatic event that is known as the 4.2 kiloyear event. This is a fascinating period of recent history, and it's one that has been quite controversial among historians, archaeologists, and climate scientists. At around this time, a number of aridification events occurred in various regions of the world, including India as well as Southeast Asia, where the monsoon weakened, Amazonia, Northern Europe, and the southwestern North America. Similarly, some areas experienced wetter conditions, like Central Africa and Eastern North America. All in all, the weather got very tough for human communities, and historians recognize that several societies, including the Indus Valley cultures, the Akkadian Empire, and the Old Kingdom of Egypt, collapsed around this time. Now, however, using the 4.2 kiloyear event as a marker has been challenged by some researchers who recognize that though the duration of events does kind of cluster together, they're not necessarily related.
Mm,
And it's actually not clear just how the droughts or the weather conditions affected some societies or even helped in their collapse at all. So, out of all the boundaries given to the Holocene, this is the least secure. But it's what we have to go on for now until better research is done and more consensus is built. Because after all, one of the biggest arguments for making a early, middle, and late Holocene, official, is because authors have used early, middle, and late Holocene
mm,
without necessarily specifying what that means.
right.
So we got to standardize things here. But in any case, the subsequent history of the Meghalayan has been known for a while, for obvious reasons. It's around its start that the Holocene climatic optimum ended, and the global climate actually declined in average temperatures for a little while. That is prior to the unprecedented rise in anthropogenic warming, which is on track to raise global CO2 levels to pre-quaternary levels.
Mm,
So that's fun. Um, with the spread of agricultural communities around the world and the growth of urban societies, the human population underwent a similar, very steady rise from 72 million throughout much of the Megalayan. But it's only within the last 300 years or so that our numbers have skyrocketed to the 7.8 billion that we have today.
dang.
And this is mostly thanks to the development of new medical
Mm,
technologies and changes in farming methods that have allowed more and more people to actually survive into adulthood
right.
and thus decrease the death rate. Now, whether this is actually an issue or not, we'll talk about in the next episode. Unlike the last two discussions of the Holocene's ages, it doesn't make much sense to kind of summarize the events of human history for the Megalayan
Mm,
because so much has happened. Um, at the very least, the trends that began in the Greenlandian continued into the Meghalayan, and would be affected by a number of global transitions like the Columbian Exchange, the Industrial Revolution, and so on. Um, Before we move on, Albert, do you have anything you'd like to add?
uh, no, not really. Except to say it's exciting we've gone to this point where basically in recent history by geological standards now is yeah, we're getting up here.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. All right, let's go on to the next slide. Um, One aspect of this series that I will be avoiding is the term civilization.
Mm,
Now, the level of discourse around this word is so high that, at least I should give an explanation for how this word has been used and why it's so troubling for, recent historians. So, in all traditional world history settings, y'all have probably talked about the first civilizations emerging in the fertile river valleys across Eurasia,
mm,
and how this is where cities and states and writing and modern economics and sociology all developed. Well, ignoring the obvious issues in beginning any world history 5,000 years ago,
mm,
using a word like civilization to describe these societies is difficult because the word itself has undergone many different meanings. Now, the word civilization comes to us from the French during the 16th century, by authors discussing the fundamentals of society and progress as understood at the time. Of course, entering the so called European Age of Enlightenment, this term was given in contrast to the barbarism and savagery that was witnessed by colonists as they spread into the Americas, Africa, and beyond. Of course, for them, their civilization was the pinnacle of human progress, and there were extreme efforts to convert native peoples into their way of life. Now, fast forward to more recent times, and things have changed, at least in some circles. And anthropologists recognized and called out the harmful errors of that way of thinking, as we should. But even so, the word civilization didn't go away, but was altered to reflect similar ideas of progress with an evolutionary twist. Thus, societies were civilizations when they had acquired a number of traits that earlier societies lacked, like urbanization, complex social organization beyond the family level, economy based on capital, centralized governments, systematic record keeping, and so on. This is usually the definition that is still given today, especially in educational situations. But clearly, there are problems, most notably this inherent idea of progress, which some researchers argued was a predetermined stage in cultural evolution. So, like, all human societies were supposed to eventually reach civilization. Well, clearly, this is not how things work, and a quick glance at world history will easily demonstrate that. So, other scholars then have taken the word civilization and changed its meaning. One equally common approach is to talk about a collection of societies that shares unifying life ways, technologies, and beliefs. These would be roughly continuous through time, even as cities and states rise and fall.
Mm,
So, this is where you read or hear about things like Islamic civilization or Western civilization. But what people who use civilization in this way often forget is that they're very loose and fluid categories, and they often contradict each other,
mm,
especially when authors pinpoint different aspects. So, like, let's look at Western civilization for a moment. What does that mean? What is the West? Is it Europe? Is it the outlying colonies and their descendants, like the United States and Canada? What about Latin America? That's an extension of Europe, but you usually don't see it included in the West. Does everybody who lives in the West get included in Western civilization? And if not, what does it mean to be Westernized?
mm,
Is African American culture Western? Well, then shouldn't we include West Africa into its foundations? So many elements of Western culture are ultimately linked to the transatlantic slave trade. And so then what about other immigrant or indigenous groups who contributed to the cultures of Western countries? Are people of Western culture inherently Christian or democratic or capitalist or individualist? Communism is often acquainted with other so-called civilizations like China or Russia, but modern communism originated with the Germans.
mm,
West.
mm,
And what about older legacies? Do we consider ancient Greece and Rome to be the foundations of the West? Would they look at Western culture today and see it as descendants of their own? If you went back in time and grabbed Plato or Julius Caesar or Jesus, and plopped them in the middle of New York or London, would we recognize them as part of our Western culture if we didn't know who they were? Um, I think you can see where this is going.
right.
So, that leaves yet another least common definition of civilization available. I remember coming across this one in the writings of the historian Felipe Fernandez Armesto, where a civilization would be considered a society where humans have changed the natural environment and carved their own habitat out of it. So, they're living in nature and shaping it to their own needs, often in extreme ways that transform what was there before. This definition then is very broad and would encompass most regions of the world
Mm, right.
and extend back many more thousands of years than the typical 5K mark. Um, so, using civilization in this way eliminates the needs for checklists of terms, and it removes any of the ambiguities that come with delineations like East or West. Um, And I generally appreciate this use of the term, and I think Fernandez Armesto's explanations are sound and
Hmm.
fair. But because so many anthropologists find it easier to abandon the word altogether, I think it's just easier for us to do so as well.
Hmm.
I would love your thoughts on this, Albert.
Yeah, this isn't really discourse I'm all that familiar with, but I think I would agree with you that the last one, a society built as a human habitat, seems like a pretty reasonable perspective um, to you know to view civilization as. But I also understand that because of the kind of very checkered history of the word, it is in some ways probably a more convenient solution to just abandon it. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So in that case, then, just a few terms to help us along in this series. Cities. Cities are large, densely settled communities maintained by people with specialized roles. Now, as far as how many people make a city densely settled, well, that number usually hovers in the thousands at least. Um, and not everybody is necessarily related by family ties, but is usually unified by their location in the city itself. The roles of specialization are important because with cities, you find people who don't or can't do everything at once. There are designated farmers and weavers and builders and soldiers and so on. And everybody contributes to the well being of the city. Now, states are societies run by bureaucratic governments, which organize some control over their citizens. Now, this is a common definition, but it's not the only one.
Mm.
Some researchers would argue that states can and have existed without governments. But regardless of the definition, an important thing to note is that ancient states and modern nation states are very different things. For example, all the cities and states we're going to explore today are pre-industrial. Their economy centered around agricultural products created with human labor, whether by hand or with control of domesticated animals and their associated technologies. So let's move to the next slide now, and we'll see one of the earliest experiments in urbanization,
Mm.
and one that has not survived into later times. This is the site of Çatalhöyük in southern Anatolia. People built their homes and lived here between 9.5 to 8,000 years ago, just a few thousand years after the transition to agriculture in
Mm.
the region. Now, just why people came to live in this way, we can't say, but this part of the world was fairly rich in resources, including obsidian, which was used for constructing tools, so maybe there was a great appeal. The city consists of west and east mounds separated by a now extinct river called Karsambra, with the later mound stretching 13.7 hectares in area and sporting around 160 mud brick dwellings, all built wall to wall like a beehive. As such, people entered their houses through special openings on the flat topped roofs. They would descend down ladders into standardized rooms. Each room had designated sleeping and eating areas, and they were decorated with a number of seemingly symbolic objects that have defied clear understanding. That there's art on the walls made from red ochre, some depicting what look like layouts of the city. So maybe these are like early maps. And then there are the skulls of auroch bulls that have been plastered to resemble the animals in life.
Mm.
Now, some figures that have been unearthed, like the seated individual below, have been traditionally understood as fertility symbols, or goddesses, if you will. But recent work suggests that their use may have been brief, so they would have been crafted for rituals during important events like a harvest, only to be thrown away in the garbage after all was
Mm.
said and done.
Huh.
These were like enchanted objects, if you will.
Right.
Now, one of the fascinating discoveries of Çatalhöyük, and that was been impacted by DNA research from individuals who were buried in the floors of the homes, was that the people who lived in the dwellings do not appear to have been related by blood, as once assumed. People may have lived together under other means, shared ties to the land, or perhaps a need to find kin beyond their immediate families. So, I guess roommates might be an accurate term.
Mm.
People rebuilt their homes multiple times, and often a house would actually be burned, buried with clay, and all its furnishings burned down before people abandoned them. Now, Given the lack of blood ties, one wonders how a proto city like Çatalhöyük was governed. Did it have leaders? Well, based on everything that archaeologists have noted, um, there are no signs of public or ceremonial or government buildings. It seems that the people who built and lived here were egalitarian
Hmm.
in social structure, so more like a collective village than a city run by a king. Even so, it wouldn't be the kind of place many folks today would like to live in. Um, I mean, for one thing, people didn't always get along,
Hmm.
and researchers have found human remains that show evidence of blunt force trauma to the back of the head,
Oof.
as if they were struck by projectiles. And they found like these thick clay balls at certain sites that may have been the bullets that did it.
Oh God.
Yeah, and disease was common. There were no formal bathroom areas in the homes, so people would chuck their feces off the roofs.
Oh.
And sometimes it would leak into the crop fields, and you had outbreaks of ringworm.
Mm.
Yeah. So like this combined with other stressors like the gradual overcrowding that occurred seem to have caused the decline of life at Çatalhöyük,
Mm.
and this may have been affected by climatic changes too, as well as potential internal conflicts due to ideological disagreements. Um, so in the end, some evidence suggests a growth in social hierarchy that may have been imposed internally might have been the tipping point in the loss of this proto city.
Mm.
And so the example of Çatalhöyük opens up a rich discourse in anthropology that extends into things like sociology and politics. Is egalitarianism feasible in urban settings with
Mm.
thousands of people? Are cities successful if they have no leaders? Is social hierarchy inevitable as more people come to live in one place? Well, I wish I had the answers to these questions, but that's the fun of discourse.
Right. Right.
Further research into places like this will certainly help us get closer to the answers we seek. Albert, what do you think?
Yeah. You know, I those are all very good questions, and of course, I don't have the answers either. But yeah, definitely, it is worth studying these ancient proto cities, if you will, because yeah, I agree. They certainly have the potential to shed light on those subjects.
Definitely. So let's go on and move to the next slide now. Um, Following the initial domestication and spread of plants and animals with agricultural societies, as we talked about in the last episode, people began to experiment with new uses for their crops and livestock. Not only that, they started to make changes in the ways that they farmed, producing greater yields and allowing for the support of more and more people in their communities. And it was processes like these that allowed cities to emerge in the first place. So we touched briefly on what archaeologist Andrew Sherratt called the secondary products revolution. That's when agriculturalists started using livestock for more than just their meat.
Hmm.
Be that using skins and furs for clothing, or using milk as a source of food and drink, or dung for fertilizer. Another important aspect of this was animal power, creating so-called beasts of burden. This unlocked new forms of energy for farmers
Hmm.
who utilized the strength of their livestock to make the processes of planting, harvesting, and construction much easier for them. So, llamas in the Andes, for example, could carry loads for people as they traveled up steep slopes. And the horse could carry people on their backs and move them faster over longer distances. The invention of the plow in Southwest Asia and Europe by 5.6 thousand years ago was important in that it sped up the basic work of a digging stick or hoe. By making a wooden frame and attaching a blade of wood or stone, and later on attaching that to a horse or an ox, the time it took to plant crops was significantly reduced, and it took far less people to get it done. Now, in some instances, animals began to be domesticated solely as roles for beasts of burden. Two notable examples are the wild ass or the donkey in
Hmm.
northeastern Africa around 7,000 years ago, and the dromedary camel around the Arabian Peninsula around 3,000 years ago. These were both domesticated by pastoralists and used for overland travel through hot desert environments. In fact, the camel played a key role in the reopening of the Sahara for trade and travel
Hmm.
following purification at the end of the Greenlandian age. Now, today, dromedary camels are so important that there are no more wild forms. The feral camels of Australia, for example, are descendants of escaped camels. Now, other key technologies that developed include the wheel, or should I say the potter's wheel. At least in Southwest Asia, the wheel was first used to help improve and speed up pottery building. By 5,500 years ago, people had the idea to take the wheel and attach it to sleds to make wheeled carts. Again, new forms of energy were unlocked because a single person could carry more in a cart and move it around easier than they could by themselves. And this was developed further by attaching wheeled carts to animals in the way that plows had been done. And in time, this became the wagon and the chariot. Now, the wheel was also used for irrigation purposes too. In East Asia, the paddle wheel, which is pictured below, transported water vertically from canal to field and had to be turned by muscle power. Now, it's often stated that the societies of the Americas never developed the wheel, but that's not necessarily true. The presence of all things, wheeled toys in Mesoamerica is indisputable evidence that at least some people developed the idea independently. It's perhaps simply because their use was not needed or didn't catch on, including the circumstances that there weren't really a lot of animals that could be used to hitch wheeled carts and wagons on. Apparently, it takes a lot of time and effort to train a llama to pull a cart, so it just may not have been worth the effort.
Mm.
Now, the importance of irrigation in the development of cities cannot be understated. In regions where local rivers flooded constantly, communities could take advantage of the rise in river levels by building canals to divert water onto their fields and adjust how much was used at one time. Irrigation agriculture could allow greater stretches of land to be used for agriculture. And as long as the water sources are stable or managed responsibly, they could be used for a very long time. So let's move to the next slide now.
Yep.
Uh, we've touched upon the development of leadership a little bit in the last few episodes of this series. Um, Many early agricultural communities had leaders who oversaw either a local community or a collection of neighboring communities. These are usually referred to in the literature as chiefs or big men. But their roles in society differed from culture to culture. They also came to power in several different ways, sometimes through group recognition of their wisdom, or through ownership of surplus goods produced by the environment, or through association with supernatural entities like the famed divine right of kings. Through a economic rise in power, a leader may build their recognition by how they controlled and distributed surplus resources to the community, often during crucial times. Many ancient societies are known in which their leaders opened the granaries when farming got difficult to sustain people.
Mm.
They were acts of benevolence. In order to go through with such distributions, it became increasingly important to keep track of everything. And it is with this that we see the new units of measurement being created.
Mm.
These were always standardized, so to leave no room for error or cheating. Thus, in ancient Egypt, for example, the Hecate unit of measurement equaled a 4.8-liter barrel of grain. Now, a key shift in the rise of cities and states was when leaders began to equip military powers towards the protection of order in the places they ruled. It was essential for leaders to safeguard their supplies from outside threats, and they were able to recruit warriors and build armies by providing incentives to serve them. By rewarding good fighters with their own surplus, as well as the spoils of war, they were able to surround themselves with people willing to fight for them and their causes. Some of the earliest leaders were warriors themselves. And deep into the medieval world, we see many examples of warrior kings who fought alongside their troops.
Mm.
As cities began to grow and leaders found themselves ruling greater numbers of people, more complex forms of government began to emerge. The codification of law shows up early in many early cities. One of the oldest known is that of Ur-Nammu, which is a Sumerian city state around 4.1 thousand years ago. The link between leadership and law is clear. This code attributes the laws to the reigning king and relates the story of how the gods decreed his right to rule and guide the people. Now, a later law code, perhaps more familiar to history buffs, is the Code of Hammurabi, shown here at the right, which is dated to 3.7 thousand years ago in Babylon. The king made sure the people knew his laws well. These things would be hammered into stone steels like the one here and placed in public spaces for everybody to see. The code covers some 282 decrees, and they all relate to matters of justice, trading, loans, marriage, public products, services, slavery, and more. As in the Urnamu Code, Hammurabi was given divine authority to bestow the laws, and people were encouraged to study the code carefully whenever any transactions or excuse me, any transgressions had occurred. Similar law codes could be found across different cultures. Many Jews and Christians today are familiar with the Book of Leviticus in the Tanakh, which is essentially a listing of law and moral codes that the Israelites followed and eventually included in their Second Temple. Now, as a quick note, another symptom of urbanization was taxation by governing powers, which were only reserved for the subordinate populace. Sometimes taxes meant goods that had to be given to leaders for, say, religious purposes, and sometimes taxes meant labor. Some leaders imposed tariffs, or that's taxes on imports, and there were cases where property was taxed too. Now, when coinage entered the world stage, and this is usually associated with the Lydians around 2.6 thousand years ago, taxation changed in form, and today it's a regular feature of nation states. Um, and no, this is not the place for me to go into the discourse about whether taxes are good or bad.
Mm.
But I do at least agree that taxes should be prioritized for public works that provide actual tangible aid to the community.
Mm. Mm.
But that's just me. So let's move to the next slide.
Mm.
Uh, Social hierarchies increase in form and complexity with the rise of greater leadership and urbanization. This chart gives a rough overview of the societal hierarchy of ancient Egypt, and some of the common trends you find in ancient societies can be seen here. So, in pretty much every case, leaders and their families always rank the highest on the social pyramid, followed by people associated with the government, like viziers, priests, and the military. And it's usually merchants, farmers, and enslaved peoples who rank lowest, which is ironic because the labor that they provided basically supported everything in the city. So you'd think they'd be viewed as the most important, but I digress. All right, Albert, any thoughts about early leadership in society that we've discussed so far?
Well, not particularly, but I think it is. It seems pretty clear how all of these kind of factors combine together to form a lot of these societies that we might be, in large part, more familiar with nowadays. And I also think it is quite appropriate to represent the social hierarchy of ancient Egypt as a pyramid.
Yeah, kind of got inspired by that.
Right, right.
Oh, too funny. Alrighty, let's continue now on the next slide. Um, as with leadership, religion changed
Mm.
as agricultural and urbanized societies developed. A general trend that emerged was the departmentalization of gods that occurred alongside the rise of labor divisions and specialized roles in human communities. You know, there were still such things as creator gods, but now they were joined by gods of the harvest, gods of the sea, gods of certain animal groups, gods devoted to construction or hunting or music. So these pantheons, which usually make up polytheistic religions, had their own histories and personalities, and they often worked with and against each other. And it's often very interesting how, in many cases, these newer gods were still as human like in quality as the spirits of older traditions, the ancient Greek pantheon being the famous example.
Mm.
Now, why this departmentalization began is quite simple. People had more stuff in their lives, more specific roles than they had before. In forager societies, particularly nomadic ones, individuals were proficient in many skills and roles in their community. But with the rise of sedentism and agriculture, roles shifted, and people started to become skilled in only a few specific tasks. And this was mirrored in the supernatural world. With these types of societies, we start to see entities that are based on specific tasks. Now, with this shift came changes in different activities. Some acts of work grew in significance as they became supervised by religious ritual. In pre colonial Hawaii, for example, the process of making a boat and going out to fish was punctuated by specific guidelines. Finding the right tree for wood required spiritual consultation. Felling the tree was preceded by prayer and feasts. Each swing of the axe was accompanied by a chant. Once the boat was built, there were worship services where different fishermen prayed to different fishing gods. And with each fishing expedition, there was a distinct ceremony. So you're talking about many days of service for something that, say, a nomadic forager would just do without hesitation.
Mm.
And that just goes to show the power of the human creative impulse in ensuring the well being and survival of the community. Now, as mentioned briefly before, religion took on greater roles in government. Spiritual leaders began to work more closely with leaders, and sometimes the roles fused together. With the development of agricultural communities and later urban cities, leaders began to be bestowed with supernatural credibility. Now you started to see things like the manna of Polynesian leaders, which gave them supernatural power to keep everybody safe. You see the mandate of heaven in China, which dictated the divine right to rule throughout its entire history, even today. The earthly manifestation of the god Horus within the Egyptian pharaohs, and so on. And the layout of their homes changed with them. Now we began to see ceremonial complexes and places of worship where the gods and spirits and epics were given more and more pictorial form. The photographs at the bottom right of the different Persian, Greek, and Egyptian deities are a limited sample of this remarkably beautiful artistic tradition that accompanied many of the earliest cities and states. Now, a particular discourse has arisen regarding all of this. Did the origin of moralizing gods help develop the first urban societies and their spiritual leaders, or did urbanization happen first, and then did religion become more of a moral backbone to its citizens? Well, this doesn't appear to be there doesn't appear to be a consensus on this matter, but there was one 2019 study from Harvey Whitehouse and colleagues that argued for the latter. This is based upon research from a comprehensive database of world societies that tracks the emergence of hundreds of pre-industrial societies and their religious traditions through over time, which is seen in the graphic above. And what they argued was that with the growth in population density in the new cities, it became necessary for moralizing religious traditions and laws to become established to maintain this rise in social complexity. And over time, this moralizing facet became much more pronounced, especially as some gods became more omnipresent, so they turned into big gods.
Mm.
Now there was a way for leaders to control the behavior of thousands of people without having to lift a finger, because the intricacies of a society's faith ensured that every individual was on constant guard not to offend or anger the gods, because punishment became much more severe in death as well as life.
Mm.
Now, this big gods hypothesis is just that, a hypothesis. And some other scholars have casted doubt on it by arguing that many communities already had the means to control large masses through collective experience, even before moralizing deities emerged in the first place. And of course, it may be that both situations occurred in different societies, but without better evidence, we can't be sure. Now, granted, much of this is necessarily generalized. The particular histories of the various polytheistic, henotheistic, which places emphasis on one community god but acknowledges others, and monotheistic religions, where there's just one god, are vast and way beyond the scope of this series.
Mm.
If you want to learn more about, how the Greek pantheon emerged or how the god of Jews, Christians, and Muslims changed over time, there are plenty of great resources out there that you can look at. Regarding the latter case, one resource that's been a big help in this series is Robert Wright's book, The Evolution of God, which takes a nuanced and evidence-driven approach to the origin of monotheism and its subsequent morality.
Mm.
And apparently, there's a new book coming out in November by Francesca Stavrakopoulou called God and Anatomy, which looks really good. Alrighty, before we move on, Albert, any thoughts?
I find it interesting, how the kind of, yeah, the departmentalization, as you call it, of gods kind of co-occurred as the roles of human individuals in societies started dividing up the labor and becoming more specialized. That is not something I had really made a connection between before. So, yeah, that is very intriguing.
Right. And it's amazing, like how specific a lot of these can be.
Right.
I know in the Hawaiian example, there are gods for like certain kinds of fish and fruits.
Mm.
That's how specific this departmentalization had gone. It's very, very fascinating. Um, all right, let's move to the next slide. Um, During the time of urbanization, two significant technological shifts occurred at separate times in different places around the world. The Bronze Age is recognized to have begun in Eurasia, specifically Southwest Asia, around 5,500 years ago, and seems to have radiated outwards to neighboring regions. Independently, bronze working began in East Asia roughly 4.7 thousand years ago, and seems to have spread into Southeast Asia rather than originating separately there, as was once hypothesized. In the Americas, bronze working developed twice, once in the Andes around 2,000 years ago, and again in Mesoamerica within the last 800 years. Now, bronze is an alloy of copper and small amounts of tin, but sometimes other minerals are used, like nickel or zinc or arsenic. While copper working was widespread around the world, and the technology of smelting was beginning to catch on, the development of bronze was much slower because of the rarity of materials needed. Tin, for example, is not a native mineral. It has to be removed from different ores, and the sources of those ores were often far beyond the sites where metalworking societies lived, so it had to be acquired through extensive trade. And that meant that for the first peoples of the Bronze Age, this new technology was reserved for the elite classes. But as it became more popular through its increased durability, I mean, it's tougher and sharper than copper, and its fluidity, it's easier to work with than copper. Bronze working became more intertwined with daily life. And with that came changes in everything from art to warfare, as seen by the daggers here. The second major technological shift was the development of iron.
Mm.
Now, human societies knew about iron for a long time, and they saw it as a very valuable material. Meteoric iron, for example, was highly sought after, as we saw with the high Arctic cultures. Because iron isn't an alloy like bronze, but a pure metal, it required less ingredients to make, but, and this is important, it needed much more heat to smelt, on the order of 1500 degrees Celsius or more. And that meant the invention of larger furnaces. But given that it was even more durable than bronze, the practice became increasingly important. We don't know when exactly people figured out how to smelt iron in this way, but the earliest known records of the Iron Age hail from Sub-Saharan Africa, around 5,000 years ago, as discussed in the last episode. Later records show up in southern Eurasia between 3.8 and 3.2 thousand years ago. But so far as we know, it was not independently developed anywhere else in the world, but rather spread as technological knowledge.
Mm.
Even so, other societies took this new information and did wonders with it. The blast furnace was invented in China around 2,500 years ago. This allowed for the creation of iron carbon alloys to make cast iron. And the Haya people of Tanzania invented carbon steel around 2,000 years ago, which makes iron even stronger than before. So incredible stuff. Um, let's move to the next slide. And speaking of trade,
Mm.
again, urbanization encouraged an expansion of other human lifeways. We know from the archaeological record that people have traded items over long distances since the last glacial period, but the scale of trade during the last 6,000 years far surpassed what happened before. Many disparate societies became so intertwined through trade networks that some societies began to think and talk about global villages. In ancient Greece and Rome, the ecumene designated the entire known habitable world and all its interconnected cities and states. And the development of farmer and merchant classes meant that there were now people who specialized in producing surplus goods and selling them to others. Trading has historically involved concepts of debt and reciprocity, as items of value were exchanged between societies that needed them. Even if the definitions of valuable varied from place to place. Egypt, for example, made frequent trade with the land of Punt, which is famously debated about in historical circles because no records exist of just where it was located.
Mm.
I guess it was so familiar that nobody bothered to write down where it was. Um, Although there is some research that has been done, and they have it in good faith that it probably lies somewhere in the Horn of Africa.
Mm.
But there, the Egyptians valued gold and ornamental trees and exotic animals, which the inhabitants of Punt traded in exchange for common foods. Now, in time, as markets grew, so did the levels of trade, and technologies like wheeled vehicles and sailing ships began to find new uses in carrying greater numbers of goods. And of course, the invention of coinage and later paper money transformed trade as well, because now there were new systems of value that could be attached to material goods. Which is a bit unsurprising that this happened at all, because, I mean, humans have historically valued metals in the first place. In many cases, the leaders of respective cities or states established contact and connections with each other, and this ensured whatever goods were being traded actually made it to their destinations. So, along some routes, caravanserais were constructed solely to provide far traveling merchants with a place to stay and rest. And sometimes trade routes were guarded by the military against bandits. A notable example being that of the Mongol army along the Silk Road. Speaking of which, the Silk Road, which is pictured here, of Central Eurasia, which formed about 2.2 thousand years ago, was probably one of the most dramatic examples of the evolution of trade.
Mm.
An over 6,400-kilometer trade route that ran from Southwest Asia to China, the Silk Road was a major source of technological and cultural exchange for the societies of Afro Eurasia. Besides the titular silk that was transported from China to South Asia and later smuggled into Europe, the Silk Road was how Buddhism reached China,
Mm.
how Greek art styles reached India, and perhaps how the Black Death reached Europe.
Mm.
Now, the Silk Road is just one of the most extreme examples of the growth of trade. Many societies supervised or established maritime trade. Both the Phoenicians and the Greeks traveled around the Mediterranean and set up their own trading colonies, where they could sell everything from pottery to crops to minerals for smelting. And some regions became trading hubs, like the Malay Archipelago. And in some cases, whole societies formed in part thanks to the growth of trade, like the Minoan cities on Crete. So yeah, the unsung hero of world history, trade.
Mm.
You know, one of the factors that have, given us our modern global world. So now let's jump to the next slide and let's talk about writing.
Mm.
Writing holds an interesting place in the human story. It's through written records that historians have been able to uncover the intimate details of ancient people's daily lives, particularly, of course, along the societies that developed it in the first place. You know, there's just something about records like this that are both wondrous and humorous because they really demonstrate in perfect detail that people haven't really changed as far as our emotions, desires, and life lessons are
Mm.
concerned. Consider this passage by the high priestess Enedwana of Ur in Southwest Asia. She was the first human in recorded history to have signed her name on her writing. So we can actually say this person wrote this. It's a hymn that she wrote for the temple of Ningishida, who is the god of flora and the underworld. And this was over 4,000 years ago. All right. Most ancient and terrible shrine, set deep in the mountain, dark like a mother's womb, dark shrine like a mother's wounded breast, blood red and terrifying. Though approaching through a safe seeming field, our hair stands on end as we near you. Gishbanda, like a neck shock, like a fine-eyed fishnet, like a foot-shackled prisoner's manacles. Your ramparts are massive, like a trap. But once we're inside, as the sun rises, you yield widespread abundance. Your prince is the pure-handed priest of Inanna, heaven's holy one, Lord Ningijida. Oh, see how his thick, lustrous hair cascades down his back. O Gishbanda, he has built this beautiful temple to house your radiance. He has placed his throne upon your days. Now, right away, you can see and feel in the writings the sense of unease the people felt entering such a dark temple,
Mm.
and the joy and relief when the sun brings light to the inside. What makes such rich literature so fascinating is that, in its inception, writing was not developed for the purposes of composing such works as this.
Mm.
Many of the great stories and prayers and knowledge reserved and revered by ancient peoples was passed down orally, transmitted carefully from generation to generation, and preserved in the minds of people. When people started writing things down, they did so to keep records of transactions or provide short inscriptions to communicate with the gods. The best known history of writing can be seen in Mesopotamia. Agricultural communities around 10,000 years ago had initially invented these clay tokens with symbolic markings to indicate, say, how many bushels of wheat were traded. In time, to deal with larger numbers of goods, the markings came to represent specific numerical amounts. And eventually, tokens were placed on strings and enclosed in clay envelopes for ease of travel. And the next leap, by 5.3 thousand years ago, was to record administrative affairs on clay tablets with a stylus using pictographs, so that if you need to represent a fish, you draw an image of a fish on the tablet. And this later morphed into a logographic script called cuneiform,
Hmm.
where written characters represent specific words. Now, this is the sort of writing we also see in Egyptian hieroglyphs or with the Chinese Hanzu.
Hmm.
Now, these scripts, like bronzeworking, were initially reserved for higher classes. The scribes who underwent rigorous training to work with logographic writing were responsible for these sorts of things. Much of the early writing we find in the ancient world are lists of inventory, of locations, of dynasties. And it's with the invention of alphabetic scripts that's where we see symbolic letters that represent sounds, what we would call phonemes, and that are then combined to make words that have meaning. Now, the Proto Semitic script in Egypt of around 3.8 thousand years ago represents the earliest known alphabet, and its influence spread far and wide. Because its simplistic style from earlier, more complex logograms meant that the larger masses could learn it quicker and thus gain literacy. Now, from the Proto Semitic script developed the Phoenician alphabet, which traveled across the Mediterranean and influenced the cultures like the Greeks, the Romans, and the Indians. And the Paleo Hebrew alphabet, which formed the basis for the earliest writings of the Jewish tradition. Now, similar changes occurred in other parts of the world. Chinese script, for example, underwent many changes to reflect different needs, and it became possible for people who spoke very different dialects to read each other's work, even across the centuries. Um, because now, uh, um, well, I guess, and the rest, of course, is history, literally, because now it became possible to have written histories like that of Herodotus or Sima Qian. Now, writing developed numerous times around the world, as you can see here on this chart, and this is an area of active research, particularly regarding just how different scripts influenced each other and just what some scripts actually mean. In the latter case, some written records, including the Harappan and Minoan Linear A scripts, have yet to be properly translated.
Hmm.
And of course, many parts of the world did just fine without writing. It's not a prerequisite for urbanized states. Throughout the Americas, glyphic writing only developed 3 times among the Zapotecs, the Maya, and perhaps the Olmec, but that's debated. In Polynesia, the curious Rongo Rongo script of Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, has raised more than a couple of eyebrows. Um, there is no evidence to link this script from any neighboring Pacific culture. It's only found on this island. And the presence of glyphs representing extinct palm trees demonstrates, their age at the beginning of Rapa Nui settlement. And to date, this script has never been deciphered. When Europeans first arrived, barely anyone on the island could read it, as it seemed to be reserved for the leaders and their families. So, yeah, see, this is what I talk about when I talk about like actual mysteries
Hmm.
of ancient history. Um, Today, around 86% of the world is literate, which is a fairly steep change from just over 200 years ago when that number was only 12%.
Hmm.
And clearly, writing was one of the most dynamic cultural changes of the human species. I mean, I think it's safe to say that a production like our series, much less a computer or the phone you're watching us from, would not have existed without it.
Right.
Um, so yeah, okay, that's metallurgy and trade and writing. Albert, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Uh, no, I don't think so.
Alrighty, well we can move on then. So for the remainder of this episode, as before, it will be a worldwide tour of urbanized societies, traveling across different geographical regions on the map pictured here, and going through the ages to see just how history played out during their inception and early years. So we'll start with the poster child for early urban societies, Southwest Asia, before moving into the Nile and Indus valleys, mainland Europe and the Mediterranean, East Asia, Southeast Asia, the various cultures of the Pacific, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Americas. Now, again, prehistory will bleed into history, and many of you history buffs will certainly recognize some of the cultures and monuments described here. alongside a few that haven't really received enough attention in popular culture, in my opinion. Um, as a disclaimer, this is not meant to be totally comprehensive,
Mm.
but I have done my best to cover as wide a scope of cultures as possible without making this episode encyclopedic as it usually is. So let's go to the next slide.
Right.
Um, I've saved one of the largest pastoralist expansions for this episode because many of its effects were felt within the last 6,000 years. Today, the Indo European language family is the one with the most speakers in the world. It encompasses over 3.29 billion people. This is mostly because European colonization has spread these tongues far and wide across the continents. English is spoken by over 1.34 billion people, Hindi by 600,000 people, Spanish by 543,000 people, and that's just the tip of the family's diversity. Now, the links between languages as distant as French and Bengali were discovered in the 16th century, and today the tree of relatedness has been confirmed and roughly charted by many linguistic and genetic studies. Now, some mysteries remain, including the exact phylogeny itself, and new research has opened up more discourse. Now, the maps on this and the following slide chart, one new hypothesis regarding the routes, archaeological cultures, and the flowering of languages that came with them. So, around 8,000 years ago, Proto Indo European speaking farmers inhabited the Zagros region of present day northern Iran. Now, over the next few thousand years, a number of communities seem to have adopted pastoralist practices and spread out westward and northward. Speakers of the Anatolian language family moved into their namesake region beginning 6,000 years ago, where they gradually absorbed the native agriculturalist populations, which spoke a now extinct language family called Kuro Urtartian, as well as Hattic. Now, other groups speaking the Albanian and Hellenic language families moved even further west into the Balkans and the Aegean around 5,000 years ago, and they too caused a gradual assimilation with the farming populations. At about the same time, groups of Armenian speakers moved north into the Caucasus, where they shared the land with a number of regional cultures who spoke distinct languages, like Kartvelian. This is a common thread across the Indo-European expansion. As these communities traveled and established themselves, they transformed the demography of the regions they reached. And in many, but not all cases, native languages were wiped out and replaced with the new ones. But before the spread of these subfamilies, however, one key movement north around 7,500 years ago established the Indo-European language family on the western Eurasian steppes, founding what archaeologists call the Yamnaya culture. And we'll see that on the next slide. The Yamnaya were one of the steppe communities that acquired the horse following its domestication by foraging cultures. We know quite a lot about these Indo-European speaking peoples thanks to a combination of good archaeological sites and the reconstruction of their words through historical linguistics. The Yamnaya, for instance, attached their horses to wagons, which helped in their travels as they herded sheep for their wool. They constructed burial pit mounds called kurgans, in which important individuals were buried with valuable grave goods made from gold, silver, and bronze. Now, metallurgy was put to battle as the Yamnaya constructed new kinds of specialized daggers and axes. So blacksmiths were given their own unique status in society, as reflected in the fact that their kurgans would be filled with the metal tools that they constructed. So it seems, based on genetic evidence, that the Indo-European speakers spread into Europe, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent was not fully facilitated by a warlike bloodlust, as had been proposed by earlier researchers.
Mm.
We just don't find huge signs of battle across Eurasian sites. Only sparse clashes around some Central European sites. It seems that more likely the descendants of the Yamnaya originally moved into less populated areas before gradually coming into contact with native farming communities. In time, culture changed both ways. In the archaeological record, we begin to see less kurgans and other nomadic features as families started to settle down. And of course, the native cultures began to lose their languages. Now, the map of European tongues during the past 5,000 years records a number of regions where we have evidence for past languages. A free sample of what must have been a rich smorgasbord of speech. Some, like the Minoan language of Crete, the Etruscan language of Italy, and the Paleo Sardinian language, are all extinct. But at least one of these, the Basque language of Iberia, still remains. The Basques actually represent a really fascinating example of cultural resilience. With very little influence, they have remained in their homeland and kept their tongue for some 3,000 years,
Hmm.
despite the massive historical changes that occurred around them, including, of course, the Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
Now, from their homeland of Central Asia, the Indo European language family spread far across the land. One now extinct lineage, the Tocharians, reached the Tarim Basin after 5.3 thousand years ago, when their ancestral culture, called the Afanasivo, is known in the archaeological record. The Tocharians represent a curiosity in East Asian history. They built a number of oasis states in the fertile regions of the basin and were well known to both the Turco Mongolic pastoralists and the various Chinese dynasties. But their language seems to have died out in the 9th century, and admixture with Turkic speaking Uyghurs marks the end of their chapter in the human story.
Hmm.
Now, later eastward movements over 4,000 years ago, beginning with the Central Asian Sintashta and later Andronovo culture, took the Indo European languages to South Asia, and funnily enough, back to Southwest Asia.
Hmm.
So, kind of a full circle thing was going on. This is the Indo Iranian branch of the family tree, and in the people's expansion south, they passed by the settlements of the Oxus peoples, who used irrigation agriculture and built their homes with mud bricks. While little to no genes were exchanged, it appears that a few cultural elements were taken up by the Indo Iranians, including technologies and aspects of farming, and even new words for their vocabulary. And after that, around 3.8 thousand years ago, their population expanded into southern Asia, and there appears to have been a split between people speaking Iranian and those speaking Indic or Indo Aryan, and thus the respective histories of Southwest Asia and South Asia were changed. Now, the Iranian family includes the Persian, Kurdish, and Afghani languages, while the Indic family includes Hindi, Bengali, Punjabi, Nepali, and Romani. Meanwhile, far to the west, Europe experienced a number of large population expansions that introduced the Balto Slavic, Germanic, Italic, and Celtic language families. It's possible that a number of factors contributed to this spread of peoples, including a cooling of the European climate after 5.2 thousand years ago, which opened up much of the western steppe lands to them. Again, contact with native farming communities appears to have been gradual and only partially marked by warfare. Um, Evidence is clear that these Indo-Europeans knew about battles. One of the early traces of this westward spread is recorded in archaeological sites as the corded ware culture, after the rope-like impressions that the people pressed into their pottery. The warriors used bow and arrows and battle axes in combat, and they would ride on horseback for efficient travel. It's with them that researchers believe the Balto Slavic languages, which include Polish, Czech, Lithuanian, and Russian, entered Europe. Now, farther west, a separate expansion is recorded in the bell beaker culture, also named for their bell shaped pottery. Their range across Iberia, France, Italy, and the British Isles has led to rich discussion about the nature of their influence on Europe. Did the bell beakers overwhelm their neighbors through population turnovers, or was their spread more gradual and assisted by trade and cultural exchange? Well, genetic evidence suggests the latter. Now, the shift in language, of course, was very notable. The Germanic languages influenced the northern regions and crossed into Scandinavia, and today includes Dutch, English, Swedish, and German. The Celtic languages made headways in Central Europe and the British Isles, and includes Welsh, Irish, and Scottish Gaelic. The presence of the Etruscans in Italy likely created the split, which gave us the Italic language family, which separated it from Celtic, because there's a strong connection there. And of course, the Italic language family includes the Romance subfamily, which we owe Spanish, Portuguese, French, Romanian, and Latin to. So clearly, the expansion of the Indo European peoples was a crucial event in world history and also marks the last major prehistoric movement of peoples into the region of Europe.
Hmm.
So turning it into a further conglomeration of different ancestries. We'll touch upon some of the later cultural developments of the Indo Europeans and their neighbors during the rest of this episode. But is there anything you'd like to add, Albert?
Not in particular. I don't have anything particular to add, but this is obviously a very complex story, and it is interesting to see how it has given rise to, many of the cultures that we are now familiar with or are a part of.
Definitely, yeah. I agree. All right. So moving on to the next slide with our global survey. The so called cradle of civilization has traditionally been marked here in Southwest Asia. But of course, world historians have been taking a much less romanticized approach to thinking about this region of the world. While it was an important aspect of the ancient world, it was not the mother culture of all things civilized that early researchers thought it was, but instead, it was a collection of disparate but interconnected cultures spread out across Mesopotamia, so between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Caucasus Mountains, the Levant of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Zagros Mountains of the Iranian Plateau, and the Arabian Peninsula. Now, over a time span of roughly 2,500 years, the societies of this part of the world knew each other well, at times coexisting and trading, and at other times warring and conquering. So, between 8.5 and 7.3 thousand years ago, parts of Mesopotamia entered the Ubaid period. This marks a transitional period when trade networks expanded, technological developments in construction, farming, and aesthetics emerged, and populations grew large and began to live in urban communities, that is, cities. The land between the two rivers was a far more fertile and wetter place than it is today. And given that the northern ice sheets were still melting around this time, the sea level was much higher, so that the Persian Gulf reached further inland. Even so, throughout the Ubaid period and beyond, resources were never a guarantee, and especially good times were limited to the winter months when the rains were at their highest. Thankfully, the key crops of the early agriculturalists, so wheat, barley, lentils, chickpeas, etc., they grew in the winter along the alluvial soils. So the southern Sumerians and their northern neighbors could feed themselves and made innovations in canal digging through the increased roles of local leaders. It was around 8,000 years ago, incidentally, that the earlier expansions of farming villages ceased, and much of the region actually became depopulated. It's not that harvests were failing. On the contrary, it's that more and more people had begun to cluster together into towns and cities. There, cultural changes occurred which were to lay the foundations of life in Mesopotamia, including an increase in elaboration of temple building and the shaping of local religious traditions. Uh, the earliest known cities in the region were places like Eridu, Nineveh, and Uruk in present day Iraq, and their emergence marks the start of the Uruk period, around 6.2 thousand years ago. A typical city in ancient Mesopotamia consisted of a central temple complex dedicated to a specific deity, where the local leaders lived, surrounded by greater urban communities and shops. This was walled in and heavily guarded, and you can only enter through richly decorated gates. And surrounding all of this were the crop fields and farming villages that supplied much of the food. Now, these cities were ruled by kings who supervised greater administrative services, and eventually their rule extended into larger territories until the individual cities became the focal points of city states by 4.8 thousand years ago. Some of the earliest written records that actually provide some historical background to these city states include the dynastic kings lists. Now, one of these kings, Gilgamesh, seems to have been a real person, but his influence was so great that he was forever immortalized in the world's oldest known piece of literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, the Sumerian city states of southern Mesopotamia were one of the earliest urban cultures where thousands of people across larger territories were under the control of such leaders. Now, previously, the local leaders of the city states warred with each other, but now that outside powers began to eat at their edges, the need to band together was greater than the need to quarrel. It's possible to speak of Sumerian capitals like Ur, where matters of trade and warfare could be managed, which was important because trade routes had by now extended as far as the Indian subcontinent. The ziggurat of Ur, pictured at the top, was one of the many temple compounds that emerged across the Sumerian lands, where the devotion to the gods had grown so strong that local communities believed that they actually lived there, which would mean that only religious leaders could enter. And the ziggurat of Ur itself is an impressive structure. Today, it's partially reconstructed, and it measures 64 meters long by 45 meters wide by roughly 30 meters high. So, not to ignore the outside powers, other societies inhabited the wider world during this time. Semitic speaking peoples ranged across northern Mesopotamia and the Levant. In the latter case, they're colloquially known as Canaanites. Now, this is an artificial term. because the communities here were only linked by geography, language, and aspects of culture. But otherwise, they ranged from sedentary farmers to pastoralists. They grew Mediterranean crops like olives and grapes, as well as grasses. They worked with copper and bronze metallurgy, and they often feuded with each other. To the north, in the Caucasus regions, the Kura Araxes culture also used bronze metallurgy, and they built mud brick homes around their farmlands, where they developed their own wines. I've already spoken briefly about the Anatolian Hatic and Hurro-Urartian speakers, the latter of which who would eventually expand into northern Mesopotamia and found the state of Mitanni. In the Zagros region, the Proto-Elamites, based on the capital city of Susa, developed their own written script that has yet to be translated. Now, if we move to the next slide here, greater historical records, which were emerging as written scripts like Sumerian cuneiform developed, began to help flesh out the archaeological record in Southwest Asia. They provide context and details for a number of increasing changes to human societies here, and they're supplemented by an increase in aesthetic imagery, including relief sculptures, which help give us visuals into some of these societies. Now, the dynastic city states of the Sumerians rose and fell many times, while trade networks grew more extensive. Territorial conflicts began to mesh with foreign trade because leaders realized that greater power came with greater control of routes and resources. Hence, we see King Lugal-Gazalgesi of the city-state of Umma around 4.3 thousand years ago, declaring that the god Enlil gifted him literally everything between the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf. Now, historians are unclear as to whether he ever made any significant progress on securing his gift, but we do know that by the end of his reign, it was ironically marked by somebody who would fulfill that goal.
Hmm.
So not long after his proclamation, Sargon of Akkad conquered these Sumerian city-states and brought about the world's first empire, in which a vast span of peoples and their lands were united under authoritative rule in one territory. Empire building soon became the norm in Southwest Asia. The Semitic-speaking Akkadians' rule only lasted some 180 years, after which the climate in the region grew very dry. And this is, again, probably associated with the 4.2 kiloyear event. Now, records and remains tell of drought and starvation and social unrest, and a nation from the Zagros called the Gutians took over the region 4.1 thousand years ago. But they too struggled to maintain any sort of stability. Before one Sumerian king, Ur-Nammu, who we talked about earlier, consolidated a new empire, the Neo-Sumerian. So there grows a particular trend in subsequent Mesopotamian history. Climate grows continuously drier, rivers change their course, city-states and empires come and go, both from within and from without. So the Babylonians and the Assyrians of the north took over things on many occasions, introducing a number of developments into the Southwest Asian world, including advances in astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and the preservation of Sumerian texts through translations. It's through them that we know a lot about Sumeria in the first place. Without getting too ahead of ourselves, what was going on meanwhile? The Canaanites of the Levant had by now diversified into a number of fascinating and familiar cultures who made strong incursions into foreign territories. The Phoenicians, of course, are a descendant culture. And then there's the Hyksos, who managed to penetrate into Egypt around 3.6 thousand years ago and shake things up there. The Amorites traveled eastward into Mesopotamia and seized their own power as well. Now, of course, a particularly influential culture was that of the Israelites, the ancestors of the Jewish people. Now, the details of their history are controversial because while researchers have traditionally taken everything written in Tanakh verbatim, subsequent archaeological work has added concerns about some things, including the actual nature of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah themselves. You feel free to consult relevant researchers for their takes because we do not have time to go into that here. Moving from the Proto-Elamites to the Elamites proper, they established their own state around 5,000 years ago, right in the southwest of the Zagros Mountains. Now, the language of the Elamites is an isolate. We don't know what it's related to, but at the very least, we've been able to translate it, so that's nice. They were polytheists, like pretty much everyone in Southwest Asia, and they amassed enormous wealth through their bronze metallurgy and trade with South Indian cities. Further east, the Kassites played a more militant role in history, for they ruled a greater part of Mesopotamia around 3,500 years ago. And incidentally, they too also spoke a language isolate, but both their days were numbered. The movements of the Indo Europeans across Southwest Asia caused two major changes. The Hero or Tartan societies were gradually displaced by the arrival of the Anatolian speakers from the east, who at first coexisted with them and later absorbed them. The first of these that formed their own state were the Hittites, around 3.6 thousand years ago, who are credited with refining the art of chariot warfare, which would influence other states over time. It was with the later arrival of the Iranian speakers around 3.8 thousand years ago that would cause the greatest change. Two daughter cultures are recognized around this time: the Medes, who show up 2.67 thousand years ago, and the Achaemenid Persians, who would swallow up all of Mesopotamia and the Levant around 2.55 thousand years ago under their empire, first ruled by King Cyrus. Now, the first Persian Empire succeeded for 220 years because of its governmental policies. Each province was watched over by a local governor or satrap who kept meticulous records. There was a system of roads that was built to encourage efficient trade and travel. And most notably, the cultures and religions of its subject citizens were left more or less alone. Various leaders actually assisted in the reconstruction of sacred spaces, of which the most famous example was that of the first King Cyrus, who ended the Babylonian captivity of the Jews and helped rebuild Jerusalem. The Persians' own religion, Zoroastrianism, contained many elements, including concepts of good and evil, that have been proposed to have influenced Christianity. So, for ruling such a vast area, the Persian Empire would leave its mark long after it had eventually fallen. Um, Curiously, little discussed in world histories are the pre-Islamic kingdoms of southern Arabia that first emerged around 2.8 thousand years ago. And this is in part because they are surrounded by mystery. The Sabaeans, for example, left little written records, but they are recorded in religious texts from outsiders. In the Tanakh, the land of Sheba is generally associated with it. Um, it's at this point that archaeology really blends into better written records.
Hmm.
So we'll leave Southwest Asia alone here. But my goodness, what a rich history!
Yeah.
Um, even though it's no longer accurate or fair to label this the cradle of civilization, I think we can safely say that its legacies were truly global. What do you think, Albert?
Yeah, I would agree with that assessment, especially after hearing all of this. Definitely.
So let's move on now to the next slide. Um, the cultures that flourished along the Nile Valley in the ancient world had undergone much of its evolution during and after the African humid period, long before the first dynasties emerged. In the lands that would become Egypt, irrigation agriculture, long distance trade with Southwest Asia, copper metallurgy, large population densities, mummification, hieroglyphic writing, and the pantheon were already in place when the lands of Upper and Lower Egypt, so that is southern and northern Egypt respectively, were unified under one state by the first pharaoh, Narmer, around 5.1 thousand years ago. Now, a pharaoh, recall, was a king who represented the bridge between the common people and the supernatural world, if not a living god himself. The famous Narmer palette, one side of which is shown here at the left, gives symbolic form to the unification. The large figure in the middle is Narmer. He sports the crown of Upper Egypt, for that's where he hailed from, and he's in the process of striking down a man from Lower Egypt. Now, the unification itself was, of course, much more complex than this, and likely was the end result of a longer political process. But its start marks the beginning of the early dynastic period. Here, the founding of the capital at Memphis in Lower Egypt solidified the consolidation of centralized power, and the city controlled much of Egypt's political and economic matters for many years. Hieratic script, having been previously developed from hieroglyphic script into a cursive form, increased in use as a means to better record communications, particularly on papyrus sheets, which is where we get the word paper from. In time, it came to dominate written records, while the hieroglyphic script shifted to a primary use on monumental architecture. Speaking of which, buildings became much more grandiose during the dynastic period, and it's with the pharaoh Djoser, who was the 21st king of Egypt, that we see the first pyramid. The step pyramid was built in decreasing sections as it towered some 62 meters into the air. Now, projects like this were the result of very strong kingship, leaders who were able to control the massive amounts of people needed to construct such a tomb and the surplus of resources required to support them. This is certainly easy enough, for the pharaohs oversaw taxes in both agricultural products and human labor. Now, to see the larger development of this, we have to jump to the Old Kingdom of Egypt, which began around 4.52 thousand years ago, and is represented simply by the perfection of pyramid building maintained by political stability. Now, pyramids, first and foremost, were royal burial tombs, a chance for the pharaoh to ensure that his passage into the afterlife was most excellent. The kings were able to complete these projects within their lifetimes because they had managed to win the general public over to their divine power. So this was not a matter of enslaved peoples forced at the whip to work, but rather a systematic team of conscripted workers who were called by the pharaoh in a sort of draft to travel to the construction site and live there for periods of 3 month shifts for 30 years or so.
Hmm.
Villages they lived in were well stocked with the best food in Egypt, which is a far cry from the bread and beer that almost everybody usually ate.
Mm-hmm.
And there was even a nearby hospital in case of work related injuries. The most famous of all Egyptian pyramids are, of course, the three great pyramids at Giza in Cairo, the largest of which was built for the pharaoh Khufu, who was the 27th king of Egypt, and held the record as the tallest feat of architecture in the world for over 4 millennia. Now, in its prime, Khufu's pyramid measured over 230 meters wide in nearly a perfect square, deviating at most only 20.3 centimeters, and it stood over 146 meters tall. It was built, like all the pyramids, out of limestone blocks, in this case, some 2.3 million of them, and smoothed out externally with white limestone casting. And the very top was placed a capstone of unclear make. Some people in the film industry, show it as gold, but we don't actually know if that's the case. But to see the entire thing in the light of the desert air would have been like the sun brought down to earth,
Hmm.
which was important, as the prayer of one capstone reads, "May the face of the king be opened so that he may see the Lord of the horizon when he crosses the sky. May he cause the king to shine as a god, Lord of eternity and indestructible." Now, the subsequent history of ancient Egypt becomes better known with time and surviving records, as dynasties come and go and foreign powers increasingly lay their claim to it. This history is extensive as far as world societies go, and it really makes you appreciate deep time. You know, I'll never forget watching Crash Course World History almost a decade ago and hearing John Green talk about how the time span between the Giza pyramids and the death of King Tutankhamun was the equivalent of 5.5 histories of the United States put end to end.
Damn.
Yeah, that is impressive. And that's not even the whole history of Egypt either.
Mm-hmm.
But if you couldn't already tell by this slide, Nile history encompasses more than Egypt. Further to the south of Upper Egypt was the land of Kush, also known historically as Nubia. Kushite culture co-evolved with Egyptian culture during the African human period, and the relationship between the two was never any one way. For starters, the Kushites rivaled Egypt with their own construction of towns and temples, including pyramids, and their kings were treated with supernatural reverence too. And this was all independently of Egypt, by the way. Regardless of, or I should say, regarding specific aspects of culture, we come out a bit short in the early years, particularly the Kerma culture of 4,500 years ago. And much of what we know is through the Egyptians that were in contact with them and gave them trade opportunities. Egypt really came to like the land of Kush because it was very wealthy to them. Gold was a top commodity that meant greater power. So it's unsurprising that Egypt, during the later New Kingdom of 3,500 years ago, actually conquered Kush and annexed it into their new empire.
Mm.
It was not a wholesale defeat, however, because the Kushites ushered numerous rebellions while also taking up aspects of Egyptian culture in the meantime. So by 3.07 thousand years ago, these methods paid off, especially since Egypt began to face its own issues at the hands of outside powers following the infamous Bronze Age collapse, which
Mm.
we'll talk about in a moment. And the newly constructed Kingdom of Kush ushered in an age of greater wealth and political power for the region. So much so that for a time, Kush actually conquered Egypt and set up their own line of pharaohs.
Hmm.
So, yeah, the relationship between Egypt, Kush, and the rest of the African continent is a curious matter. because it seems that prior to the domestication of the dromedary camel, the western and eastern deserts along the Nile limited contact between different societies. Now, that's not to say, of course, that ancient Egypt wasn't an African society. It totally was. The influences of peoples across the region played a big role in the development of Nile cultures in the first place. Um, uh, Popular culture, however, seems to have it that ancient Egypt was all that Africa had to offer as
Yeah.
far as so called high civilization
Right.
was concerned. But yeah, that can't be further from the truth. I mean, there were hundreds of African towns, cities, states, and empires that emerged over the last 3,000 years or so. And we'll meet some of them later in this episode. But for now, let's move to the next slide and come to the Indus Valley. Contemporaneous with the Sumerian city states and dynastic Egypt were the Indus Valley cultures of South Asia. And they were clustered around present day Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northwest India. Now, these were the successors of the agricultural communities that developed here with the aid of Southwest Asian influence around 9,000 years ago. By 6,000 years ago, communities had formed a number of large fortified settlements out of mud bricks from the alluvial soils of the Indus River. And these sites, including Kotji, near the border of Pakistan, were meticulously laid out with planned streets and manufacturing centers for redware ceramics and other goods. The fortifications and their relation to the river system, which overflowed every late summer, have convinced researchers that their construction was for protection against floods. The farmers made especially good use of the floods. Without needing to rely on irrigation techniques, they would build special embankments into the soil and allow the floodwaters to channel into the fields through these special openings, which were then blocked. So this gave time for the water to soak into the soil, which was then, cultivated. Now, this method, which eliminated the amount of people required to farm, would go on to sustain life along the Indus River Valley. Archaeological remains tell of population growth and an increase in urbanization, as well as a growth in connections with the outside world. Trade was established with Mesopotamia and very likely controlled by Indus merchants, who traded luxury goods like clothes, furniture, and precious metals for Southwest Asian crops, wool, and leather. Indus trade goods were stamped with special seals, like the one pictured at the top right here, and they bear a unique script that has yet to be deciphered. Now, the height of Indus Valley culture occurred by 4.6 thousand years ago and is marked by the appearance of huge, densely populated cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, the latter of which is sometimes used to name the culture as Harappan. The levels of construction and engineering that went into these cities were some of the most ingenious in the ancient world. I mean, besides the planned streets, the Indus peoples built sewer systems with drainage pipes that ran underground and were connected to every home. So they ensured a level of sanitation that wouldn't be surpassed by in other urban areas for over 2,000 years. I mean, we don't see anything like temples or large government buildings at these sites, which is interesting. Many archaeologists suspect that the Indus cities had some sort of bureaucratic leadership in order to plan everything so neatly, but it's just as likely that order was maintained communally. Further evidence for what may be an egalitarian social structure is the sheer lack of anything related to warfare or militaries, suggesting that conflict was rare between them. In the literature, you'll find statues like this one at the left that are called priest kings, but we honestly can't say for sure who they represent. Priest king is just sort of a side effect of earlier scholarship. For all we know, this could be just an average Joe or something. So the Indus Valley cities by 3.8 thousand years ago were on the decline. Evidence suggests that environmental changes was the main driver. Following the 4.2 kiloyear event, the region became much drier as the monsoon weakened, and one of its rivers, the Saraswati, evaporated completely,
Hmm.
and it cut off an important source of sustenance. And the irony of all of this is, by not developing irrigation techniques for farming, the cities had no way to sustain themselves with what little water they now had for their crops.
Hmm.
And so, in time, genetic studies show the people began to abandon their cities and move away from the Indus River Valley and into the subcontinent, where they formed new homes and admixed with indigenous communities. Now, harking back to a small comment in the last episode, it has been speculated by some researchers whether the Dravidian speaking peoples of southern India owe their inception to this merging of cultures, but this is still unsure. The distribution of Dravidian languages on the continent makes sense. In this scenario, and there is an ethnic group called the Brahwai in Pakistan today, which has been treated as a relic population from the Indus Valley cultures, but this has not been confirmed. Evidence against this hypothesis includes the fact that the vocabulary of Proto-Dravidian itself includes a lot of terminology for South Asian plants and animals that do not live in the Indus region. It may just be that it may just be likely that Dravidian is a much older language in origin, predating the Indus Valley cultures as an indigenous development of South Asia. But of course, more research would be needed. Now, the history of South Asia continued with the establishment of new agricultural communities across the subcontinent, including the Ganges region, as well as the arrival of Indic-speaking peoples from the north around 3,500 years ago. This is recognized as the start of the Vedic period, when Hinduism was in its infant stages, and it introduced new cultural changes, including what would become the caste system of India. Now, much of this was recorded in the oldest of Hindu texts, like the Vedas, which tell of philosophy, ritual, and cosmology, and they include some very fanciful but wonderful stories of gods and kings and battles that seem to have some basis in historical events. In time, urbanization would return to South Asia through the establishment of Vedic kingdoms and the eventual founding of the Mauryan Empire around 2.2 thousand years ago. But that's a story for another time. Okay, so now we've covered Egypt and Kush and the Indus Valley. Albert, do you have anything you'd like to add about them?
Not really, I think.
Alrighty, then we can move on now to the next slide. Um, a little discussed aspect of ancient history regards the Cucuteni Tripelia cultures of Eastern Europe, who established urban settlements of astonishing size at roughly the same time as the Ubaid cultures of Mesopotamia,
Hmm.
from roughly 7.5 to 4.73 thousand years ago. Following the introduction of agriculture into Eastern Europe with the linear pottery cultures, the founders of the Cucuteni Tripelia cultures settled between the Danube and Dnieper rivers within the Carpathian mountain range and its rolling plains. Unfortunately, while we've been able to piece together some form of chronology and genetic history of its people, we don't really know a whole lot about them
Hmm.
or their culture. There are no outside records that exist for this place and time. And internally, there is a unique script called Vinchaturdas that remains undeciphered. So everything we have comes from the archaeological record. Still, what we have been able to find offers some fascinating clues. Evidence exists of what have been called megastructures that began to be built around 6.1 thousand years ago. These are buildings comparable in design to the surrounding homes, but often much larger in scope. In some cases, over 1,600 square meters wide. Now, researchers argue that these spaces served as public buildings, perhaps for communal activities. But as far as what these may have been, it's unclear. We don't even know what the social organization of the Cucupeti Tripelia cultures were like. As with the Indus cultures, we don't see anything indicating, a centralized government or kingship. At the very least, the presence of increasingly specialized pottery and textiles and the layouts of some homes suggests some social complexity that might require social classes for specialized roles.
Hmm.
Now, the difficulty in piecing together the culture probably owes to the fact that, for some reason, the cities were inhabited between 60 and 80 years and then burnt to the ground, only to be rebuilt and inhabited yet again.
Huh.
Now, this is not a unique life way for early peoples. This sort of thing was occurring in Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, for example. But just what this meant to the people engaged in this activity, we can only speculate. Um, some researchers talk about it's a symbolic nature of burning down your home and building it again, being like the cycle of the seasons or what have you. But
Hmm.
we don't really know that for sure. In the end, the Cucuteni Tripelia went down in history as yet another society that collapsed and left no clear descendants. Recent genetic research at different sites suggests that contact was established with Yamnaya pastoralists around 5,500 years ago, which appears to have been gradual and sometimes violent, as stated previously. But the main cause of societal collapse has been suggested to have been, in a similar vein to Çatalhöyük, over internal disputes about governance. This argument states that some individuals of unclear status attempted to establish some form of hierarchical leadership to oversee the increasing population density, which was received poorly due to a lack of positive results. In time, this appears to have exacerbated things, and by 4.75 thousand years ago, the Cucuteni Tripelia culture and its cities vanished from the archaeological record.
Mm-hmm.
This was one of the first times that urbanization came to Europe, but it certainly would not be the last, as we can see on the next slide. Now, with the start of the Mediterranean Bronze Age around 5.2 thousand years ago, comes the reemergence of urbanization, along with monumental architecture typical of ancient cities. It's actually here in the Mediterranean where the first instances of bronze metallurgy began in Europe, among the small village communities that descended from the early agriculturalists. They were well versed in seafaring technology and were able to take advantage of the rich fishing that the Mediterranean offered. Now, I mean, this whole area of the world, 2.5 million square kilometers of sea, also offered a range of physical regions, including mountains and fields, valleys and forests, which fostered regional cultures that became highly connected through constant trading, all under a generally mild climate that was never too humid but not too cold either. The earliest communities to build urban settlements in the Mediterranean were the Minoans of Crete, whose palatial culture emerged around 4,000 years ago. Now, this term is used in reference to a number of sites that seem to show large palace like structures that may have been palaces, but we can't say for sure. I mean, they certainly seem to have had roles of great importance as regional centers because archaeologists have found archival materials inside them and different rooms for housing surplus grains, performing rituals, and providing entertainment, like board games. It's just as hard to say what role leadership played in these cities. The name Minoan derives from the legendary king Minos, who supposedly lived in the palace of Knossos, where the Minotaur lived. Um, that's where pioneering work on this culture first began at the turn of the 20th century. Now, despite the attribution, we know nothing concrete about government, and there's little to no signs of military or defensive fortification beyond the hilltop locations of the sites. The merchants and farmers of Minoan Crete don't seem to have worried too much about warfare, and that's not to say that life was totally without bloodshed. Human sacrifice through bloodletting has been found at some sites, usually on teenage boys. Now, much could be said about the Minoans. They're personally one of my favorite ancient cultures, incidentally, for their mystery.
Mm-hmm.
And I know Trey the Explainer made a wonderfully illustrated video about them that we'll have to link to.
Oh, nice.
But what's especially fascinating about them is their perseverance. Throughout the 400 or so years of Minoan culture, the Cretan cities were leveled by earthquakes and volcanic eruptions twice, and both times were rebuilt to similar and sometimes grander standards. Now, in the end, though, their society did collapse, and their mysterious script called Linear A was lost and remains to be undeciphered. On the mainland Aegean, a different but related culture emerged 3.6 thousand years ago, the Mycenaeans. Like the Minoans, these peoples relied heavily on marine foods, but they grew crops like olives and wheat on the mainland. But their main distinction lies in their social structure. We have very good evidence that the Mycenaeans were not only ruled by elite kings, but they also fortified their settlements and trained powerful warriors. It has been tempting then for researchers to see the supplanting of Minoan Crete by the Mycenaeans by 3.4 thousand years ago as a sign that Minoan society fell due to conquest. And they've been backed up by the fact that a number of sites on Crete around that time had been destroyed, sometimes by fire. Now, whatever exactly happened between the two, the Mycenaeans did not stamp out Minoan life altogether, although they did change the script, which we call Linear B, which has been deciphered, by the way. Much of the cultural and aesthetic style of the Minoans was tweaked, while the basic economy and trade routes basically remained unaltered. Now, the Mycenaeans themselves would also end up on the decline, as they shared the fate of many neighboring cultures during the Bronze Age collapse, around 3.2 thousand years ago. Now, this period of time saw enormous climatic changes and intense warfare that put so much pressures on political powers that one by one, all but one of the states of the Eastern Mediterranean and Southwest Asian world collapsed into obscurity, burning to the ground and seeing their citizens scattered. One of the players in this story are the so-called Sea Peoples, an often discussed mystery in ancient studies. No, we're not talking about like Aquaman coming out of the water and taking down the land people. Um, contemporary scholars have failed to reach a consensus on identity, but these do appear to have been a number of different nations, not necessarily all related to each other. Um, and alternative approaches to the traditional narrative that the Sea Peoples aided in the collapse of these societies through warfare instead understands these incoming groups as refugees from some unfortunate circumstances somewhere in the Mediterranean region where they came from. Um, so yeah, another mystery, of course, is just what that unfortunate circumstance could have been, much less where these people were coming from. Arguments have ranged from mainland Europe all the way to the British Isles, all sorts of different ideas, but we can't say for sure. So what little genetic research has been done on the Mycenaeans shows trace amounts of admixture with people of Zagros farmer ancestry, and that suggests that the Indo-European speaking peoples had begun to settle in the Aegean, the founders of the Hellenic language family. Now, the nature of this settlement and the end of Mycenaean culture from 3.15 thousand years ago is considered by historians as belonging to the Greek Dark Ages. Now, the name is not meant to be derogatory. It simply reflects a period when written records, including Linear B, cease, and aspects of life become foggy to understand. But thankfully, we can get some idea of what people were doing through the writings of great oral traditions. Scholars recognize that the Iliad and the Odyssey, traditionally ascribed to Homer, but he may not have even existed or represented multiple people, were composed orally during the Greek Dark Ages, and they contain cultural memories of past Mycenaean life. Now, when they were finally written down between 2.76 and 2.10 thousand years ago, the Dark Ages had transitioned into the Archaic period, and we see the consolidation of new city states, or polities like Athens, Sparta, and Corinth. So ancient Greek culture, with all its battles and philosophy and artwork, starts to make its mark at that time. And we can now leave historians to tell the rest of that story. Now, in the time following the Bronze Age collapse, other cultures started to flourish in the Mediterranean. From the Levant came the Phoenicians, who were seafaring merchants and one of the creators of the first alphabetic scripts. Through their expansion across the sea between 3.1 and 2.8 thousand years ago, the Phoenicians founded trading colonies as far as the Iberian Peninsula in northern Africa, where they exported quality goods like Lebanese cedarwood, copper and iron ores, and their famous purple dye made from Urex snails. Now, one of the colonies founded in present-day Tunisia, Carthage, became a very important player in ancient history through its transformation into a powerful military state. The famous story of its troubling and violent relationship with the Romans is outside the scope of this series, but it does give us a segue into to talk a little bit about life in the Italian peninsula. So many different cultures lived on this mountainous and fertile sliver of land. And the most famous of them would be the Etruscans, who show up in the archaeological record as the Villanovan culture around 2.85 thousand years ago. They were a Bronze Age culture turned iron. They composed many city-states that each were ruled by a centralized government. Their extensive artwork, which includes sculpture, tells us of a strong military tradition and a passion for arts and music, and a strong respect for the dead, as evidenced by tombs that have been found to contain whole families. Though it is unclear as to what extent the Etruscans seem to have played in the role of the emergence of Rome, um, we can definitely see influences there, as Rome turned from a small village into a city state. Now, as far as we know, the legend of Romulus and Remus is just that. So we have to turn to archaeology to tell us Rome's origin story. While the Etruscans descend from native agricultural communities, speaking a language that is now extinct, the Romans appear to have been Italic speakers who overthrew their neighbors and shaped their own society with a little help. By the time of the Republic, 2,500 years ago, the Roman people had risen in power and population and would eventually take over the entire peninsula from the Etruscans around 2.2 thousand years ago. But again, that's a story for historians to tell. So before we leave Europe, we have to clarify the situation further north. But before then, Albert, do you have anything to add?
No, I think it's fascinating to hear about all these early cultures are often, I think, given the shaft in mainstream kind of resources about this topic.
Oh yeah, or they're just oversimplified,
Yeah, right.
which is always frustrating. So I hope I'm able to clarify a couple things for you viewers.
Mm-hmm.
So going to the next slide now, ancient history of Europe is, speaking of which, is often overshadowed in popular world histories by
Mm,
the Greeks and the Romans.
right.
But there were interesting things going on north of the Mediterranean too. Although the various mainland European societies here did not engage very strongly with urbanization, they still maintained large cultural spheres and actively helped shape the history of their southern neighbors. For example, Aegean trade in amber and tin was helped by communities as far away as Scandinavia and the British Isles,
Mm,
and Bronze Age warriors often fought and raided Mediterranean settlements, notably the various Gallic invasions of early Rome, including the famous sacking around 2.39 thousand years ago. So, copper using or chalcolithic cultures had been in place since at least 6,000 years ago in Europe, and we know a little bit about their ways of life from a number of sites, including burial grounds that provide details of social stratification. Let's see, the Iceman, who was remarkably uncovered in 1991, has given us fascinating details too
mm,
into chalcolithic life 5.3 thousand years ago. The incoming population expansion of Indo-European speaking peoples beginning 5,000 years ago marks the beginning of important changes to the agricultural societies, for it was they who introduced the horse, wheeled vehicles, and the plow. Now, coupled with the earliest practice of bronze metallurgy around 4,500 years ago, it becomes possible to speak of a Bronze Age in mainland Europe, just 700 years after the Mediterranean. As mentioned prior, the two prominent cultures that emerged during this time were the corded ware culture in the east and the bell beaker culture in the west, marked in the archaeological record by distinctions in pottery and other technologies associated with new social structures. And this is seen especially in one of the successor cultures to the corded ware, the Urnfeld people of 3.8 thousand years ago, named after their practice of cremating the dead, placing them in urns, and then burying them in vast cemeteries. This tradition is known widely across Central Europe, and we start to see the leaders of various communities overseeing surplus goods and trade routes as domestic livestock like cattle and sheep were being used more than ever before. Now, more and more political alliances were forged between different groups of Urnfield peoples who rallied behind rulers. Warfare intensified, and the horse drawn vehicles were incorporated more into battle by warriors armed with bronze armor, shields, axes, and slashing swords. Urnfield settlements, which were not truly urbanized, were heavily fortified by large wooden palisades, a sign of attention to outside threats.
mm,
So the slow passing of the Bronze into the Iron Age starting 3,000 years ago only saw an intensification of this pattern. Though the practice was at first much harder to master than bronze, it did make agriculture, construction, and warfare much more quick and efficient, and so new societies emerged. And one of these, the Hallstatt culture of 2.75 thousand years ago, and its successor, the Latin culture of 2.45 thousand years ago, can be considered representative of early Celtic life in Europe. Here, the transition from bronze to iron is clearly seen in different sites, and evidence abounds of intricately sculpted helmets, swords, jewelry, pottery, and ritual sculpture. Settlements increased in size during the time of the Celts, and it's with the Latin culture that we can speak of proper towns for the first time, of which dwellings, as before, were all built of wood, as you can see in the reconstruction to the right. The subsequent history of the Celts is further revealed by historical literature from Rome, and even as the Republic turned into an empire, the Celts managed to hold on to their settlements throughout much of that time. Now, neighboring societies, which also played important roles in European history, include the Scythians, who inhabited the former lands of their Yamnaya ancestors in West Central Eurasia from 2.6 thousand years ago. In many ways, they carried on the traditions of their Indo European antecedents, more so than their other descendants did, living in a semi nomadic lifestyle, riding on horseback through the steppes, and burying their elite in earth mounds. Now, the warrior prowess of the Scythians was often unmatched in the ancient world, and it's generally recognized that the Greek legends of the Amazons represent Scythian warrior women. And much further in the northwest, in Scandinavia, the Nordic Bronze Age that developed 3.7 thousand years ago, from a fusion of the native pitted ware that we talked about last episode and incoming Indo European corded ware peoples, marks the beginning of the Germanic speaking peoples we think of as the Norse. Now, the efforts of these cold weather seafaring peoples, including their Viking raids, are usually discussed in the historical pop culture of the medieval period, but archaeology has given us insights into their earlier life ways. And not just burials or housing settlements either. We also have some very lovely rock art that's been carved onto the coastal cliffs, which show everything from animals of the hunt to the world famous large wooden ships. that were used for travels. So, okay, I think that covers Western Eurasia, but what about the East?
Mhm.
Well, we'll go to the next slide. Following the emergence and spread of rice and millet agriculture in East Asia, communities experienced a major boom in population density around 6,000 years ago. In a similar vein to what was happening in Bronze Age Europe, many villages started to associate themselves with local warrior rulers, who began to oversee fortifications around their settlements as protection for their irrigated croplands. The rise of these leaders was linked to religious aspects of life. They were kin based, which is significant because families felt deep respect and reverence for ancestral ties. This, of course, would be later emphasized in later years through the practice of divination, or communication with ancestors, as well as ancestor worship itself, particularly in a political context. Now, along the Huanghe River were the Longshan cultures, and along the Yangtze River were the Langshu cultures, which were linked together by newly established trade networks, which also marked the start of the Chalcolithic in China. Now, political life became much more socially stratified, and in general, we see the rise of urbanization soon afterward, although the farming communities would remain much as they had been and would be for thousands of years, only connected to the fast paced, ever changing urban world through a basic loyalty to the ruler. Now, one of the most important and largest of these early cities was Arlito, located in present day Henan. It was established around 3.9 thousand years ago as the center of a much larger urban kingdom, the end result of a brief period of environmental troubles that pressured the East Asian communities towards extreme competition and ideological shifts. It is with the Arlito that the bronze metallurgy really began to take off, though it is still confined to the elite classes who controlled trade and oversaw territorial expansion. The wealth and power of Arlito's leaders only grew from there, and some scholars talk of a world system that began to be maintained by them, in which control was assured by ritual practices. Now, if you know your Chinese history, you may recognize that the first dynasty was the Shah under Yu the Great, who are traditionally dated to have began 4.2 thousand years ago. And you may also recognize that this association is highly controversial. Largely, it's based largely on legends that were recorded long after the events which were supposed to have occurred, and not even during the time that dynasty was around.
Mhm.
Research over the last few decades has tended to recognize a possible link, given the archaeological sites that show a clear urbanization and increasing rule by powerful leaders, between the city of Arlito and the Xia dynasty. Now, is that connection founded? We don't know for sure. At the very least, the first definitive Chinese dynasty is that of the Shang, starting 3.76 thousand years ago. It was not the only state to have emerged along the Huanghe and Yangtze rivers, but because it's the one with the most research done on it, not to mention that the earliest writing is traceable to them, historians tend to focus on it more. In reality, the Shang and its neighbors likely operated on the same principles. They were ruled by local kings who oversaw operations from their capital cities surrounded by earthen walls. With the passing of each king, the capital often moved around, never in place for more than a few hundred years or so. Regarding their written script, Shang's inscriptions are first found of all places on animal bones and shells. Oracles were used for divination, and they would meet with royalty to communicate with the ancestors. Special messages, sometimes describing rituals, would be carved into the bones, which were placed in fire to examine how they cracked. And then the oracle would read the cracks on the bones and relay their messages back. This was one aspect in which leaders sought divine knowledge to rule their states. Now, regarding earthly matters, Shang kings commanded powerful conscripted armies and they were frequently at war with other states, often gathering tens of thousands of captives and using them for ritual sacrifice. Combat for East Asian warriors was usually with bow and arrows, shields, and halberds, which is what you get when you cross a spear with an axe. And they carried their own sharpening stones just in case.
Hmm.
Now, beyond the findings of archaeological remains, we don't know much else about the Shang dynasty. In the general cycle of warring states, the Shang were overthrown 3.12 thousand years ago by the neighboring Zhao, thus kickstarting their own dynasty. However, it would be inaccurate to say that things began very differently from before. As far as the size of the state, no major borders expanded. Agricultural production, trade, and economics, all those stayed more or less the same. What makes the Zhao special in Chinese history is one, the shifts in governance, as the state would end up split into almost independent provinces that continuously warred with each other. Two, bronze working reached its height and is exemplified by vessels like the one pictured at the top right. Three, the written oracle script became a clerical script that started to record historical matters. And perhaps significantly, four, the golden age of Chinese philosophy began during this time. The so-called hundred schools of thought emerged towards the last half of the Zhao dynasty, including Confucianism under Confuci and later Mengzi, which describe humanist principles and an emphasis on family, Taoism under Lao Tzu, Zhuangzhou, and others, outlining a system of maintaining balance and harmony, Moism under Mozi, outlining universal love some 400 years before Jesus, and legalism under Shang Yang, Han Fei, and others, which outline bureaucratic matters. Now, much of China's iconic cultural traditions can be traced to the Zhao dynasty and its philosophers, but it only became accurate to talk about a unified China 2.22 thousand years ago, when Qi Shi Huang, king of the Qin state, annexed all the surrounding states into a single empire, the Qin dynasty. And this is the same Qin who led the construction of his own burial tomb guarded by terracotta warriors,
Mm.
and who was notoriously anxious of betrayal. So, to secure his safety, he ruled China with an iron fist, spreading tyranny through his military. Most famously, he burned a lot of books and buried all the scholars alive in the
Mm.
ground. Um, and of course, China's subsequent history becomes much better known through written records. And as I've been doing in this overview of cultures, we need to move on from that. Um, Before wrapping up East Asia, Albert, do you have anything to add?
No, I don't think so.
Alrighty, let's go to the next slide now. Um, Throughout much of their history, the Korean Peninsula and the Japanese archipelago have had many influences from the mainland, and this was increasingly so as China rose to prominence following unification under the Qin Empire. Even so, Korea and Japan were, and still are, distinct societies with their own cultural traditions. In Korea, the earliest urban kingdoms emerged by 2.6 thousand years ago, though tradition places that date much farther in time. These kingdoms, including Gojoseon in the north and Jin in the south, followed similar trends that were occurring on the mainland. So leaders ruled over fortified towns and would expand them by either overtaking other kingdoms or uniting with them to form confederacies. By the time of the Proto Three Kingdoms period, around 1.7 thousand years ago, the most prominent were Goguryeo, Bakchi, and Shilla. These were now Iron Age societies who traded with both Japan, Manchuria, and China. Now, relations were not always smooth, however. The Proto Three Kingdoms period began when Gojoseon was conquered by China's Han Dynasty. The true Three Kingdoms period saw the expansion and militarization of the Goguryeo state over most of the peninsula at the expense of the three other kingdoms, which should technically make this the Four Kingdoms period, but
Hmm.
that's just how things are named at the moment. Korean history around this time is one of constant buffering between states, both foreign and domestic. Around 1.59 thousand years ago, China under the Sui dynasty invaded Goguryeo, then a powerful empire that pretty much had control over the entire peninsula. But their reign wouldn't last. Uh, with the collapse of the Sui and implementation of the Tang dynasty, an alliance was formed between them and the kingdom of Shilla, and the two of them worked to bring down the Goguryeo Empire around 1.33 thousand years ago and made Shilla the reigning kingdom of Korea. This was in opposition of Pakchi, which had formed their own alliance with Japan. Pakchi had managed to make itself a significant maritime power, but they too fell around 1.35 thousand years ago in the expansion of Shilla's power. In the background of all of this, cultural exchange was dramatic. Pakchi is credited with bringing Buddhism, a written script, iron metallurgy, and silk farming, among other things, from China to Japan. And life for the common folk in Korea was about as average as it could be for an East Asian agricultural society, marked by a supernatural world full of spirits. In fact, when Buddhism arrived in Korea, it did not push out these native beliefs, and it found a way to acknowledge and include them into its philosophy, which is a good example of how Korean peoples used aspects of Chinese culture while not fully succumbing to them. Now, across the sea, the Yayoi period of Japan transitioned to the Kofun period 1.75 thousand years ago. As with some of the other societies we've been exploring so far, this period is known by historical records through the newly introduced Japanese script, but the details are very fuzzy, and we rely heavily on archaeology to fill in some things. The name Kofun refers to the large burial mounds where the elite classes were laid to rest. Social stratification in Japan was very prominent during this time, and communities were originally run by militaristic clans who claimed divine rule. It's during the Kofun period that the imperial court under the Yamato clan was established. Now, this governing system was led by an emperor who maintained power through a hereditary system, said by some to be one of the longest and most continuous in the world for at least the past 1,500 years. So that's commitment.
Hmm.
Now, by the end of the Kofun period, Buddhism and Taoism had been introduced into Japan from Korea, and these two philosophical systems changed how people lived there. For example, the decline of Kofun building by elites was tied to a shift in perspectives on life and death through Buddhism. Thus began the Asuka period 1.44 thousand years ago, and it's now that historical records become especially good. They tell of a rather stable rule by the Yamato clan, reforms in art, architecture, and bureaucracy, and the emergence of Japan as a concept. Now, the subsequent history of Japan with its shoguns and its literature, that's a story for another day. So, if we can jump to the next slide, um, much further away, the story of urbanization in Southeast Asia mirrors that of Korea and Japan because its indigenous innovations were merged with foreign influences in the realms of technology and religion. So the Bronze Age began with the introduction of metallurgy practices from China around 2.95 thousand years ago. This shift in technology encouraged the growth of material wealth for local leaders, because even with its arrival from the outside world, bronze was still reserved for the higher ups. Coupled with the rise in rice farming and regional trade, and the later introduction of iron metallurgy 2,500 years ago, Southeast Asia changed from a land of regional villages run by local rulers into a collection of population dense towns that were connected in trade to both mainland Eurasian states and the island communities of New Guinea through newly improved seafaring technologies. Now, the maritime trading communities of Southeast Asia are well known. I mean, this was the culture that gave rise to the Lapita voyagers, for example. Trade goods include spices like cinnamon, crops like bananas and sugarcane, precious metals like gold and silver, and other sought after items. It was this interlinked world of trade that allowed Hinduism and Buddhism to arrive in Southeast Asia from India around 2,000 years ago. And to say that their influence was important is a bit of an understatement.
Hmm.
The various rulers of the different Southeast Asian cities saw the value in these new belief systems in securing their rule. By 1.8 thousand years ago, the first states and kingdoms emerged with an emphasis on loyalty through divine recognition. And we see this change not just in the new political systems, but in the art styles too. And we begin to see the massive proliferation of all these beautifully decorated temples across the region. So, an age of god kings in the same vein as the Egyptian pharaohs had begun. Now, it would be way too confusing to go too deeply to the subsequent history of Southeast Asian states because political stability was never maintained for very long. Scholars talk of a fluidity to Southeast Asian polities with no clear territorial boundaries or long term alliances. Of a few, we can only mention in passing, like the Srivijaya kingdom of Sumatra and the Majapahit of Java, who at various times were the center of the world in terms of trade and political influence. Most familiar to historians is probably the Khmer Empire of Cambodia, 1.19 thousand years ago, with its beautifully carved Hindu Buddhist temple of Angkor Wat, which is 163 hectares across, pictured to the right here. Massive control of food surpluses and a dedicated workforce by a divine king led to its construction, and significance was so great that even today Cambodian monks still worship there. So, all right, now that we've fleshed out Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia, Albert, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Hmm. I think I'm good.
Alrighty, so let's move on then to the next slide, and we'll go to the Pacific Islands. Now, these are a bit out of scope for this episode.
Hmm.
We don't see the kinds of urban cities here like we do everywhere else in around the world. But I really want to talk about them a little bit in the interest of completeness.
Yeah.
If I had time in the last episode to talk about them, I would, but I didn't. So that's why we're here. Um, in the years after their first settlement by Polynesians, the islands of the Pacific developed a fascinating array of diverse cultures of varying political complexity and social stratification. Sometimes these seafaring peoples kept in contact with each other, sometimes not. but their relative newness on the world stage meant that they shared a lot in common with each other, including religious beliefs. In some instances, like on Tahiti and the Hawaiian Islands, powerful leaders emerged who controlled food surpluses as a form of wealth. Different clans ruled through a kin-based hereditary system, already well known among Polynesian families, who dictated the distribution of goods. There were special temples called mire that were constructed out of wood or stone, and they served as sacred spaces where the gods resided, although sometimes they served as communal areas. Now, along the Hawaiian Islands in particular, the centralization of the high-ranking leaders among the different islands became so strong that it's accurate to actually think of them each as their own states.
Mm.
Now, on the larger end of things, a powerful leadership emerged around 950 AD in Tonga that began to implement a tribute-based system of loyalty to any island communities under their control. Over the next few hundred years, this Tui-Tonga Empire had spread as far as New Caledonia and some of the Micronesian islands.
Mm.
Constant contact between the islands, imposed by a large navy, ensured that the Tongan cultural aspects were shared across different islands, along with the new trade networks that opened up. Now, more isolated island cultures that were no less impressive include Aotearoa, or New Zealand. This was one of the largest of the islands settled by Polynesians, and its location meant that although farmland was certainly more extensive than everywhere else, the climate did not permit the growth of some of the crops the Maori brought with them. The main staples then were taro, yams, and gourds. Now, as far as meat was concerned, however, the Maori had it made for a little while. Albert, your series has already covered many of the amazing and enormous birds that used to live here,
Mm-hmm.
including the flightless moa and the Haas eagle.
Yep. Mm.
Now, because these birds had not evolved alongside mammalian predators, I mean, the largest native mammals in New Zealand are like 3 species of bats.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yep.
um, they quickly succumbed to overhunting within a few hundred years because they weren't used to people. I mean, it's not like the Maori were oblivious to what they had done. There was a really cool recent study by Priscilla Wehi and colleagues that found oral and linguistic evidence that the Maori were well aware of what extinction was, and they used that understanding to alter their land management practices.
Mm.
So after 1400, Maori culture became a lot more intense as warfare increased between communities. It's possible that the loss of species and the overall difficulties of crop harvesting encouraged raiding of food. Thus, all along the landscape, we find the construction of pa, heavily fortified villages surrounded by palisades and terraced sides, enough of a sign that reads, "Keep out" to any intruders. Now, thousands of these sites have been found across Aotearoa, and it demonstrates how frequent warfare had become among the Maori, given the stakes. Now, on the most isolated island, Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, similar social stratification across the Pacific was in place, where a central leader or ariki presided over other clans with their own leaders. Now, the famous moai seen in the photo below are currently recognized by researchers as depictions of venerated ancestors of the different clans, which explains why so many of them were built. The question of how they were built and moved to their present locations has received a lot of attention. I mean, their size and weight, in some cases over 80 tons, with one unfinished sculpture in the triple digits, would have required tremendous communal efforts. It was once proposed that the massive deforestation of the now extinct Vasconcellos palm by 1650 on the island was because the Rapa Nui were in a frenzy to make these moai and they needed many logs to transport them to the coasts. A reassessment of interviews done by European colonists with local peoples seems to show otherwise.
Mm.
After the moai were carved, people say they walked to the coast. And there was this famous experimental archaeology study where teams of people use ropes to rock the statues back and forth in an upright position. The presence of broken statues and the position of their collapse seems to add further support to this, as if they had fallen from an upright position. Now, regarding the deforestation of the island, many scholars have argued that it was this that caused the collapse of Rapa Nui society, because it eroded away the topsoil. The people could no longer support themselves, and then they had resorted to warfare and cannibalism, and things just fell down the crapshoot from there.
Mm.
But this commonly told story has been pretty much put to bed by recent scholarship.
Mm.
Um, yes, the trees were wiped out, mostly through the action of the rats that the ancestors of the Rapa Nui brought with them, who chewed up all the seeds and fibers and stuff. So it was not like a deliberate deforestation. Despite this, the Rapa Nui had managed to continue sustaining themselves through their fishing practices, which provided most of their food. And they were able to continue farming through the construction of manabai. These are these rock walled structures that protected crops from intense sunlight and ocean winds. And they had rock mulch gardens too. And so I guess the notions of warfare and cannibalism, well, I mean, that these occurred on Rapa Nui are not untrue, but I mean, they were hardly as important as researchers had proposed,
Mm.
more so than had been for other Polynesian societies. Um, in the end, when Europeans arrived on Rapa Nui for the first time in 1722, they had found a flourishing, sustainable society, far from lost. Um, so the collapse of the Rapa Nui was because of subsequent colonialism instead. So yeah, hardly a great mystery as Easter Island is often called, eh, buddy?
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. So, while we know a fair amount about Polynesian cultures and history before Europeans showed up, there are still aspects we have yet to fully grasp. But as the field is slowly being decolonized and Pacific Islanders are taking their rightful place in these sorts of studies, we're learning more and are going to learn more every day.
Mhm.
So let's move to the next slide now, and we'll finally touch upon Africa a little bit. Regarding these cities, states, and kingdoms of Africa beyond Egypt and Kush, as I had talked about, there is an equally rich and diverse history that defies simple narrative. So I'll do my best to at least summarize and highlight a couple of really cool developments here. One of the first regions to develop large cities and states was in the Sahel and its neighboring regions to the south. The growing links with the Mediterranean world through new Saharan trade routes, thanks to the dromedary camel, gave communities access to outside resources and allowed them to participate in the expanding global networks of Eurasia. This is not to say that these new connections were necessary for urban communities to develop. It's not like they needed it, given, for example, their agricultural innovations and their indigenous use of iron, first in the world. But it gave leaders and merchants new sources of wealth that kickstarted state and empire building. Some early states that received these benefits include Geno in West Africa, founded 2.2 thousand years ago. Records clearly show a centuries long transition from a small agricultural Iron Age village to a multi hectare fortified town linked closely with the Saharan trade network. In Eastern Africa, the state of Aksum was founded around 2.1 thousand years ago and benefited from a parallel Mediterranean trade with the Romans. Its wealth and resources were so valuable that writers as far as the Zagros Mountains saw it as one of the most important kingdoms in the world.
Wow.
Now, a key change in the story of sub Saharan African states is the spread of new world religions, particularly Christianity and Islam. In the former case, Northeast Africa was one of the earliest foreign kingdoms in the world to accept it, less than 300 years after the crucifixion. Today, Ethiopia remains predominantly Christian, but as far as the rest of Africa is concerned, Islam spread much farther and was welcomed much more. The spread of these faiths was in part facilitated by the new trade routes, since the Umayyad Caliphate had managed to spread right across North Africa by 1.27 thousand years ago. It was in an easier position to extend its influence. So a number of immensely powerful kingdoms emerged in West Africa around this time, starting with Wagadu, or the Ghana Empire, which has shadowy origins, but was cited as early as 1.3 thousand years ago in written records. So it may have been a little bit older than that. The primary source of wealth for West Africans were the vast stores of gold that could be easily dredged up from the local rivers without much effort. And Wagadu was built right next to some of these rivers. The name Ghana is used for the leaders. They commanded so much respect and power that even in death, they were buried with their servants just so they could continue aiding them in the afterlife. Wagadu was the center of West Africa's gold production, and they traded heavily with it in exchange for elephant ivory from the north. There were African elephants in the Morocco region during this time, and they're no longer there anymore for I wonder why.
Mm.
Um, the religion of Wagadu was indigenous in origin, and as Islamic reformers moved in and placed pressures on it, the kingdom would not last. By the time the Mali Empire emerged around 790 years ago, Wagadu was a vassal under it, and its new rulers were Muslims. These kings, or Mansa, ensured safe travel to any merchants entering the cities, and they were very devout in their faith, always making sure to take part in the pilgrimage to Mecca, the site where Muhammad received his first teachings.
The journey of Mansa Musa in 1324 is well known for helping to place Africa on European maps. He had traveled to Mecca with tens of thousands of men and camels, carrying several tons of gold, which he spent so fruitfully on gifts for people and new mosques that the price of gold actually dropped in the Mediterranean for several years. Now, fast forward to its conqueror and successor, the Songhai Empire, around 550 years ago, and West Africa's role in external affairs was definitely secure. Now, moving back east, we see other states emerge, this time in connection to the growing trade networks of the Indian Ocean that we alluded to earlier. The word Swahili means coast, which is funny when people talk about the Swahili coast.
Mm.
It's technically redundant. Arab merchants had been trading with Eastern African communities for around 2,000 years, but it was only 500 years later that the emerging states in Southeast Asia connected with India, Southwest Asia, and the Eastern Mediterranean to create what could be considered a marine Silk Road. Now, East Africans took part in this trade, especially the Swahili, who developed their own merchant towns and cities while taking up the Islamic faith and culture. It was through these cities, including Kilwa and Lamu, that gold, ivory, and other goods traveled to Eurasia, while they imported spices and coffee to go with their primarily marine diet. In southern Africa, one sizable city that was built by the Shona people around 1.05 thousand years ago was Great Zimbabwe, constructed of stone bricks laid without any mortar. And as you can see from the photo, a lot of those structures are still standing. This city was connected to the Indian Ocean trade and was supervised by a king who was guaranteed half of all imports while redistributing the other half as he saw fit. Now, Central Africa also had many different states and kingdoms, all regionally distinct and supported by lakes and rivers, but they were at least linked together by trade. The diversity of these urban cities varied. Many were quite small but no less powerful. The Luba kingdom, for example, had sacred kings aided by a noble court and maintained their own court historians who remembered the entirety of the royal lineage and could convey that orally whenever needed to. Larger states like the neighboring Lunda or Rund Empire amassed multiple kingdoms under one ruler who held on to power through a strong military. Now, I could go on and on about sub-Saharan African kingdoms, but we have to continue.
Mm.
As a recommendation, two really great documentaries that I enjoyed are the BBC's Lost Kingdoms of Africa by the art historian Gus Casely Hayford, and Africa's Great Civilizations on PBS by Henry Louis Gates Jr. of Finding Your Roots, which is another fun show. Both are excellent and are visually stunning too. All right, Albert, is there anything you'd like to add about Africa before we continue?
No, not especially, except to say, as always, I appreciate you shining some light on these underappreciated parts of the world.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. I hope I'm doing a well job on that. So let's move it now to the next slide, where we reach the last section of our global survey, looking at the urban cultures of the Americas. They did not enjoy any connections to the enormous trade networks that had formed in Eurasia and Africa, but in any case, that was an irrelevant matter. The Americas developed their own long-distance trade networks and enjoyed a rich diversity of resources that allowed for the creation of some very powerful states and empires. And the earliest urban societies in the Americas are found in the Andes region, and they appear to have been heavily influenced by coastal resources. We talked a little bit about how marine resources helped to sustain the emerging agricultural societies, and this allowed for greater population densities of the sort that make up urban states. The Norte-Chico culture of Peru originated some 5,500 years ago, in parallel with events in Southwest Asia, meaning that urbanization in the Americas is roughly as old as that in Eurasia. It's also called the Corral culture, but both names really only designate two of the major cities that emerged here. Both shared the same monumental architectural layouts, with stone pyramids that were flat-topped and supported the homes of elite rulers, as pictured above here. For the first monumental architecture in the Americas, this was a pretty good start because some of these pyramids were 18 meters tall and over 150 meters wide. Now, given the dearth of written records for any time in the pre-Columbian Andes, we don't know exactly what leadership was like for the Norte Chico peoples. But if ethnographic work on later cultures and archaeological clues are anything to go by, then we're likely dealing with divine rulers who controlled resources and were able to throw their weight around to build such large stone structures in the first place. Now, monumental architecture became much more elaborately decorated in later cultures, like the cities of El Paraíso and Huaca, Florida, that were built between 3.8 and 3.7 thousand years ago, at about the same time that the Norte Chico cities were being abandoned, although just why this occurred is unknown. With these new urban areas, however, we see a notable increase in connections through trade and communication, and this likely helped set the stage for the greater spread of common Andean cultural tropes, including new types of buildings for ritual ceremonies, where families along the coast likely pilgrimaged on special occasions. Some of the cities, however, show a marked shift from coastal to inland residents, and it was then that the cultivation of native crops began to overshadow marine fishing. Urban Andean culture was becoming much more recognizable, and it wasn't long until aspects of socio-political life began to reflect later cultures as well. This is seen in the Chavin culture of 3,500 years ago, which has provided an abundance of art motifs that very closely resembles that of later Inca culture, a world of spirits and fantastic creatures, which could be communicated with by spiritual leaders who ruled over the people. Everything regarding the architecture and its decorations would have been orchestrated by this small elite class. To protect their cities from environmental troubles, like flooding from heavy rains, which is a thing that happens in the Andes, the Chavin architects designed their cities with a system of drainage that moved rainwater into special canals that actually mimicked the sound of a jaguar's roar as water passed through. And that was intentional. The shrines were beautifully decorated with gold relief sculpture, which reflected innovations in metal smithing. Now, even after the decline of the Chavin cities, these aspects of Andean life had already spread far and wide over the mountain chain and beyond. And soon, a number of different societies formed between 2.2 and 1.4 thousand years ago that took these foundations and tweaked them, creating their own diverse traditions, like the Pucara of Peru, who intensified agriculture to help support their otherwise precarious city by inventing cochas. These are raised earthen fields with these little ponds that could take up more water to fertilize crops, but they never completely dried up. And then there's the moche, also in Peru, which developed a powerful state in the dry desert through irrigation agriculture and the harvesting of seabird guano as fertilizer. It's because of the desert that archaeologists have been able to learn so much about this culture, because the sands have preserved so much. Which is ironic because it's likely due to droughts that occurred in the desert that the Moche state declined at all. Further south in desert Peru were the Nazca, with their famously enormous geoglyphs that depict native animals in geometric shapes. These Nazca lines, like the Rapa Nui Moai, have been unfairly treated as great mysteries, and by some as products of alien intervention, because of course. But archaeologists have obviously concluded that the Nazca people made these images, and they used an almost mathematical precision to do so. But the real discourse is about what they were used for, because they could not have been viewed from any vantage point by the people. So hypotheses have varied from outlines of constellations or to ceremonial pathways. So it's a very curious work there. It should be emphasized that during this time of diverse state building, bronze metallurgy developed in the Andes, likely aided by the advancements that had been done with goldsmithing. And we also see what appears to have been the first appearance of a record-keeping technology called quipu. Now, the people took strings made from camel hair or cotton fibers and tied them with specific knots, which represent information that could be read by specialists by hand. Quite a lot of information could be saved on quipus, including administrative records, and it wouldn't be too inaccurate to call this a non-written script. Now, decoding quipus has proven very tricky because, unfortunately, during the wake of Spanish conquest, many people who could read quipus were killed, and the practice was lost, although not totally in many places along the Andes. So work is currently ongoing with local groups to be able to read these quipus and see what knowledge we can know about these societies. Now, by the time of the first empires, the Tiwanaku and Wari, of over 1,500 years ago, warfare had increased among Andean societies. But what is interesting to note is that these early empires do not appear to have arisen through military conquest by powerful leaders. Instead, new research suggests these may have been maintained by mutually connected communities who spread cultural influences organically and not through force. It's only later with the Inca Empire of Tawantinsuyu that we see more typical aspects of empire building. Now, as I lamented in the last episode, South American history shouldn't be all centered on the Andes. And when we turn to Amazonia, do we find a parallel history of sustainable urbanization in the rainforest? So if we jump to the next slide, we'll get to meet some of them. In most conventional world histories, the Amazon rainforest is a harsh, unforgiving landscape where towns and cities are unsustainable ventures, thus leaving the region to be populated only by nomadic hunter-gatherers. Revelations from archaeology have put that to bed, but with a little peek from the accounts of European explorers, we can get a glimpse into this now lost world. So the first and most striking of such accounts comes to us from a Spanish missionary called Gaspar de Carvajal, who traveled to South America soon after the fall of the Inca Empire in 1536 as part of a trip to convert the Andeans. However, his mission got sidetracked as the half-brother of Francisco Pizarro, named Gonzalo, went off on his own expedition to find the legendary city of El Dorado, which had gone through its own curious transformation through European eyes. It wasn't always a big golden city, for example. It's more of a cultural phenomenon. Over the next few years, the expedition had all but failed, costing the lives of hundreds as the group got lost in the western rainforest. So Gonzalo's cousin, Francisco de Orellana, split off from the group with permission to follow another possible route by boat along the Napo River, and he took Carvajal with him. It's what the Spaniards saw that becomes relevant to us. The accounts recorded by Carvajal tell of villages and cities full of people with food surpluses, enormous armies of warriors and boats, and vast tracts of cleared land densely settled with buildings and gardens. And what was notable about these encounters is that they occurred all along the river system towards the Atlantic, where Francisco's boat finally arrived in 1542. Now, in part due to political concerns, Carvajal's writings were not published until 1895.
Wow.
But it was also due to the fact that when Europe first, heard about this journey, they just couldn't believe it. And so, yeah, even into the age of archaeology, the stories were treated as little more than fanciful European tales of magical adventures and whatnot. Fast forward to the last few decades, and modern research has basically confirmed Carvajal's long-dismissed writings. Indeed, by 1.6 thousand years ago, various Amazonian groups, including the descendants of the Arawak and Tupi-Guarani expansions, settled down and built many urbanized kingdoms along the Amazon River basin. The increasingly large populations were supported with extensive agroforestry that we talked about last episode, as well as a rich fishing tradition. In parallel with other American cities, leaders often lived and ruled over socially stratified communities atop great earthen mounds that served as the center of capital cities. Frequent contact was made between the different cities, sometimes under the arms of war, but also through trade facilitated by planned roads through the rainforest, where groups imported and exported everything from gold and animal parts to salt. Now, knowledge and cultural practices, as usual, also pass along such routes. Now, archaeologists have uncovered many different urbanized kingdoms across all reaches of the Amazon rainforest, including along the coasts. One of the latter, belonging to the Marajoara culture, was built on Marajao Island, early in the age of urbanization. There, mounds that served both residential and burial purposes for the elite classes were built all over the rivers at heights of almost 10 meters. Further upstream, the Santorim, or Tapajos culture, was a center of Amazonian trade, where they seem to have made a name for themselves by crafting very intricate pottery. This was one of the kingdoms that Carvajal recorded, incidentally, and he described it as a great white city. In the central Amazon, the Aquituba culture covered 30 hectares and included a grand amphitheater that was built into the earth with vast slopes surrounding it. This was very likely a ceremonial complex, and so it's kind of reminiscent of a football stadium, but in size, it's large enough to house 4 of them. Now, many other cities flourished over the following centuries, but not all of the region was as densely populated as this. Recent work on a number of sites also show evidence of nomadic and sedentary foragers living at most in villages, and in some cases they made little to no significant changes to the surrounding forest. However, not all of the great Amazonian cities survived to be seen by European eyes, and in some cases long before that. Beginning around 1,000 years ago, many parts of the Amazon appear to have been largely abandoned and reforested to pre-urban levels. It must have been something very significant to cause so many of the cities to be deserted in this way, but just what that was is unclear at the moment. Researchers speculate that the change may have been environmental in nature, but they don't rule out the possible societal unrest as a cause. Of course, the two are often linked in a harsh combination that can bring down the city. In any case, it was not a total destruction of Amazonian cities, seeing as the Spanish clearly witnessed a number of them that were doing fairly well. But as these European powers continued to penetrate into the rainforest, the days of urban Amazonia were numbered. So, all right. Regarding South America, is there anything you'd like to add, Albert?
No, except to say that again, this is a very underappreciated part of the history of human culture, and I think it's important to cover it.
Absolutely. I think it's just it floors me that because like you were talking about in another episode about North America not too long ago was such a radically different place in terms of the fauna
Right.
and the kinds of animals and their diversity. To just kind of think about like an Amazon rainforest like covered in these huge cities that stretch for miles and miles and miles. It's like like considering it now where like most of it is rainforest, and like underneath all those trees are like, for example, geoglyphs like this in the image here that are just kind of hidden away. um my goodness, like it's almost hard to picture.
Yeah.
It must be really incredible to see in person. And you got to wonder what must have went through Carvajal's mind as he was writing everything down. You're just passing by city after city after city along the river. It's amazing. It's amazing.
Indeed.
So yeah, let's travel northward on the next slide to Mesoamerica. Now, besides the Andes, one of the most well-known regions of urbanization in the Americas is in present-day Mexico and Central America. Mesoamerican states have enjoyed a rich archaeological tradition, and popular culture is familiar, at least, with the Maya city-states and the Triple Alliance or Aztec Empire. Even if the details in many cases range from slightly inaccurate to downright ridiculous, like the so-called mystery of the Maya collapse, which you might guess is not a mystery and was not a total collapse. The foundations of urbanization for Mesoamerican peoples began during the pre-classic period, between 3.5 to 1.75 thousand years ago. During that time, agricultural villages increased in number and size, and local rulers amassed enough wealth and power to create new classes of people, paving the way for urbanized states with centralized economies. Now, credit for the earliest of these usually goes to the Olmec culture of the southern Gulf Coast. But they weren't the only people going through this cultural trade, and their status as the mother culture of Mesoamerica is hardly accurate. Still, their influence appears to have been very great, and it's with them that we see the first signs of typical urban life, including the creation of ceremonial complexes with stone and earthen sculpture. The depictions on the walls and statues offer fascinating clues to how they viewed the world. Most notable of these are the famous stone heads, like the one pictured here at the top left. Scholars generally recognize these sculptures as representations of Olmec leaders, wearing helmets common to the Mesoamerican ball game, which is a ritual sport that required impressive skill, where a rubber ball is kept airborne using mostly the hips. It's likely that this game was another indigenous Olmec development that later influenced other cultures. Um, as a brief aside, some pseudo historians like to think of the Olmec heads as depicting Africans who sailed to the Americas, usually under the assumption that they brought civilization to the continent first. But yeah, there's no evidence for any of that, and it's very disrespectful to Amerindians. So the Olmecs were also famous for their use of jade and obsidian, which was traded widely and crafted into aesthetic objects. And this is something that we also find in later nearby cultures. It's safe to say then that even as the Olmec culture declined by 2,500 years ago, their legacy was preserved through the gradual transmission of culture to other peoples, like the Zapotecs of the Valley of Oaxaca, who emerged in history around 2.7 thousand years ago. Um, excuse me, of the Valley of Oaxaca, who emerged in history around 2.7 thousand years ago. They are usually credited with developing the earliest writing system in the Americas, but again, it must be remembered that there is evidence to suggest the Olmecs may have had a writing system too, as early as 3.1 thousand years ago. We see a greater divide in the various social classes with the Zapotecs, including designated craftspeople and priests. Now, a curious aspect of Zapotec life is that most people didn't live in the cities like Monte Alban. They were scattered around them in small villages of at most 60 people. Even so, the cities themselves were not densely populated, again, 1,000 people on average. Urbanism then was originally reserved for the rulers and elite classes who enjoyed a relatively private life. In time, though, public buildings began to emerge at the Zapotec settlements, and the cities became more urbanized as people moved into them. Leaders centered their power on the cities and ruled over small states, supported by a powerful warrior class with divine status. Around 2.2 thousand years ago, Mesoamerican societies were more closely connected than ever before, and the different peoples were able to combine their talents into the construction of even greater cities. So in the Valley of Mexico, Teotihuacan went from a measly 9 square kilometers to a whopping 83 square kilometers in just a couple hundred years, and grew in size to house some 120,000 people. Now, regarding cultural ties, it's honestly hard to say. Teotihuacan belonged to no single culture and appears to have encompassed an amalgamation of different peoples, and that has meant that outlining its political history has remained difficult. Nonetheless, the architectural and cultural achievements of the state are seemingly endless. The people utilize both irrigation agriculture and a method using chinampas, where flattened mounds of land are built inside the rivers to grow crops. And these floating gardens were very efficient because they were nutrient rich and they retained moisture. They even had their own zoological gardens, which housed many animals, including big cats. And while we can't rule out their use in biological studies, the animals did often end up on the cutting room floor, for lack of a better word, for their pelts and their meat. The pyramids, of course, are particularly impressive to behold. You can see in the image below the Pyramid of the Sun, which was one of these, spanned 220 meters long and 224 meters high. Now, while temples sat at the top of the pyramids, many of the people actually lived in specially built apartment complexes, as well as basic houses. In the outer edge of the city, that's where the farmers lived, and they supported this vast population. So, in the Yucatan, the Maya underwent their own history of cultural changes, extending into the pre-classic period, alongside the Olmecs. Like other parts of Mesoamerica, the Maya began their rise to urbanization with small agricultural villages within the rainforest, each one so sustainable and isolated that communal action between different villages was basically non existent. That all changed as people started moving into the lowland regions, predominantly farmers looking for new crop lands, as well as a growing demand by outside communities for specific resources like salt. So by this point, long distance trade networks had formed with them. For the next few hundred years, enough people had settled down in the lowlands to begin urbanization projects. And before long, we find evidence of pyramid building and greater social stratification as leaders began to be venerated as divine. It's by this time, 1.75 thousand years ago, that the classic Maya period began. That's usually what popular culture designates as so called Maya civilization. Now, one of the challenges of supporting so many people in a rainforest environment was managing water to support crops. The Yucatan does not have vast river systems like the Amazon does, and rainfall was unpredictable. My ingenuity resulted in the construction of a system of canals that pulled water vertically from underground reservoirs and into well like tanks to be used for irrigation and other needs. And this helped maintain classic Maya life for many hundreds of years, and the number and scale of the city states reached dramatic proportions. Recent survey work by archaeologists is beginning to clarify the extent of Maya classic culture. Far from being isolated cities in the forest as they're often depicted, over 2,000 square kilometers of land was converted into farm fields, roads, villages, and cities, supporting at least 8 to 10 million people, which is a shame that by 1.1 thousand years ago, classic Maya culture ended in disaster. The climate became much drier, and rainfall, as unstable as it was, reduced. The water management and agricultural systems that supported the masses were no longer working. And there doesn't appear to have been any efforts on the parts of the leaders to adapt to these changes. On the contrary, many rulers seem to have overdone themselves in tireless wars with each other. Before long, the lowland cities were abandoned as people reverted back to earlier modes of life. It was not, however, a total collapse. In the highlands, Maya cities continued to exist much as they had before. And in fact, they ended up being one of the last urbanized Mesoamerican societies to face European colonization years after the Aztecs. So if we move to the last slide here, and the last region we'll explore, as we did in the last episode, is present day United States and its own Native American cities. Once again, traditional world histories have treated northern North America as a land of simple chiefdoms who did not exceed the way of life beyond the village. And I think you all know where that's going. um, in the desert Southwest, or Oasis America, as it's sometimes called, three regional cultures emerged based around the earlier agricultural traditions of these settled communities. The first of these was the Mogollon culture around 2.3 thousand years ago, centered between present-day Arizona, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. There's little to differentiate this culture from the earlier ones. Foraging was just as important as farming, and the people lived in villages of pit houses as they had before. What had changed was the population density. The villages had gradually begun to increase in size, and we started seeing the first kivas to be constructed. A kiva is a semi-subterranean building that was used for important meetings and rituals. Their build, along with the pit houses themselves, reflect aspects of their origin story, where people first emerged from underground. Later on, but based mostly in Arizona, the Hohokam culture, around 1,500 years ago, emerged. And with them, agricultural techniques were innovated through a co-developed system of river-based irrigation and dam and terrace-directed flooding. Now, likely along similar routes that brought maize, beans, and squash into the region beforehand, the Hohokam had begun to set up trade with more southerly Mesoamerican peoples. More than goods traveled up north. Archaeologists see very clearly that cultural influences came this way. For example, the introduction of the ball game and a change in architecture towards more above-ground platform structures. But the largest shift towards urbanization was achieved north of these cultures by 2,000 years ago, from the ancestral Puebloans, who you may recognize from older literature as the Anasazi, but this is a derogatory word. It's first imposed by the Dene or Navajo peoples when they arrived from the north within the last 1,000 years. It basically means ancestors of our enemies, which refers to the descendant Pueblo peoples. So archaeologists try not to use this term anymore. They followed similar trends that the Hohokam would make 500 years later, including a use of irrigation techniques and a rising of building structures above ground. The kivas, however, remained important for both cultures. The size of these towns and cities increased dramatically, with roads, plazas, and great houses for worship. Residents of New Mexico will be familiar with Chaco Canyon and its biggest great house, Pueblo Bonito. This massive structure was multi-storied and held anywhere from 600 to 800 rooms, large enough for around 1,000 people to live in. Now, a system of roads kept the different Puebloan communities in contact with each other, and it helped facilitate trade with Mesoamerica. Recent work shows that cacao beans for chocolate drinks and breeding colonies of scarlet macaws could be found in the desert Southwest during that time. Now, a major drought struck the region around 890 years ago and caused a massive shift away from the great houses and plazas and into smaller communities in more productive regions. Now, in some cases, the people built their homes on the sides of cliffs, like at Mesa Verde in Colorado, seen in the photo below. There, the people could extract water from reservoirs and manage their crops as best they could. But soon this period would pass as well, and the region was hit by another drought some 770 years ago. And so today, the Hopi, Zuni, and other Pueblo peoples are the descendants of those who left places like Mesa Verde and connected with neighboring groups for mutual survival. Now, to the eastern woodlands, the Adena culture had developed into the different Hopewell cultures around 2,000 years ago. Now, these became very widespread thanks to extensive trade networks that connected places as far apart as the Gulf of Mexico, New England, and the Rockies. Now, at different Hopewell sites, we find many of these trade goods falling into the hands of local rulers as ways to enhance status in life and death. And the reemergence of copper metallurgy certainly helped with this too, being used to craft images of birds and geometric designs. However, the Hopewell did not live in cities. That came with the cultural shifts around 1.6 thousand years ago, that saw the elevation in status for different rulers. Their political influence affected how people lived, giving rise to new social classes, including a class of spiritually backed warrior leaders centered around what archaeologists call the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex. Populations grew around these leaders who had massive earthen mounds constructed for them to live atop of, as the centers of larger urban communities supported by newly arrived crops like maize. It's then, 1.2 thousand years ago, that the widespread Mississippian culture was born. Now, a number of these cities had been studied over the years, and none more famous than Cahokia in Illinois, perhaps the largest of its type at over 800 hectares in area. The leader's family lived at the very top of Monk's Mound, an earth mound over 30 meters high, whose base actually rivals the Great Pyramid of Giza in size, and no one was allowed up there.
Hmm.
Surrounding them was the city itself, estimated to have housed around 16,000 people during its height, which is larger than what Paris had at the same time. And other cities like Etowah in Georgia and Moundsville in Alabama, while not as large, show similar features. And it seems that the different cities were at least connected through trade, but whether any of them influenced the other or acted as a capital of some great Mississippian state, well, we can't say for sure. Mississippian culture had begun to decline in the 1500s as the cities were abandoned, and this is perhaps due to the same environmental factors that affected the Puebloans that had caused many people to scatter. So by the 1700s, most of them were gone before Europeans could get their hands on them. At least one expedition in 1720, led by the French ethnographer Lepage du Pratz, recorded details of a Mississippian society called the Natchez. Now, while there, he wrote about the class systems that emphasized the elite rulers and how the mounds were used as their spiritual homes. On one occasion, which he wrote in vivid detail and illustrated, a tattooed serpent, who was the brother of the Natchez leader, had died and was given a very large funeral. As he was hoisted through the crowd of people, his wives, sister, servants, and other people closest to him chose to follow him into the afterlife by being drugged and then strangled during the service, in which tattooed servant was brought up into the temple mound and buried inside, followed by everyone else later on. Now, this is a common trend seen in many urban societies throughout history, of which this account adds to that knowledge. So, the world we live in today, with its own amplified urban cultures, is a far cry from anything that's been seen before, as we've seen in this series.
Mm-hmm.
At the time of recording, there are over 10,000 cities across the continents, and many of them were only built within the last few decades. A city like Cahokia in the 1100s, with around 16,000 people, was already pretty impressive.
Mm-hmm.
Today, St. Louis, not far from that original site, holds over 308,000 people. And it is not uncommon to find megacities housing more than 10 million people. Trade networks and cultural influences have exploded due to globalization, and many cities share contact with each other at speeds which would make the merchants of the Silk Road pee their pants. Now, as the human story continues to unfold, we wonder how long this age of urbanization will continue. And we fully recognize that the actions of individuals on one nation state can cause ripple effects on states halfway around the world.
Mm-hmm.
This is an unprecedented time in human history. Whatever life might throw at us in the near future, we need to be prepared to face it, lest the lives of billions of people come at risk. But we'll stop here for now. Albert, do you have any closing thoughts?
Nothing I could top what you just said. I think those are great lessons to take away from this great survey of the rise of cities.
Well, definitely. So in that case, if we go to the next slide, yeah, we reach the inevitable conclusion of this series.
Oh, wow.
The epilogue to our prologue, if you will. We're going to take a quick look at the steps it took to bring our world into the present day and analyze the state of affairs today. We've come to know what the world was like in the human past, its environment, wildlife, cultures. But what about today? Well, human activity has reached tremendous levels within the last 300 years, and our global ecosystem is looking worse for wear, what with pollution and wildlife loss and anthropogenic climate change, which is a unique challenge for the human lineage. Where will this lead us into the future? What will human physical and cultural evolution look like in the future anyway? Are we even still evolving at all? We'll give some possible answers to those questions, and then we'll take a trip back to the very beginning of this series and return to the very first question that we had asked. What is human nature, and can we know it? And I hope to see you all then. So in that case, I'd like to acknowledge our good friends Henry and Alicia for their contributions to this series. Henry providing the wonderful music, and Alicia for Albert's color scheme. And if you wish to follow updates for when we release episodes, you can follow us on Twitter at Time and Clades, or you can go to our YouTube page through Time and Clades, which you are most certainly watching us on at the moment. If you have any questions for us, you are more than welcome to send a comment. We love receiving those. Or you can hit us up on our email, timeandclades@gmail.com. And of course, in the description, we post a link to references for the episode. Admittedly, the resource list is probably the shortest out of this entire series because, when it comes to summarizing the events of world history, a good number of encyclopedias will do the job that 100 papers will do. And makes it a little bit easier for me to read through that anyway.
Right.
But nonetheless, there's still some cool stuff you can learn in there and cool books you can check out. And yeah, with that, that's the end of this episode. I believe next week we're going to go back to your series. Is that right, Albert?
Yeah, I suppose we are. So we're going to do another episode of Dinosaurs, the Second Chapter, our series on bird evolution. And in particular, we're going to look at a group of birds that includes the, in some ways, notorious terror birds, which was basically when crown birds decided, well, you know what? Our cousins back in the Mesozoic had a pretty good thing going, being giant, ground-running predators in their ecosystems. We should give that a try. And, well, that produced some very interesting kind of ecosystems. And even though the terror birds are no longer with us today, they do still have a few very close living relatives that are quite interesting. So we'll be talking about them as well.
Oh, definitely. I'm looking forward to that. Those are some fun birds, like the one that I met at the museum the other day.
Yeah.
Impressive animals for sure. But until then, we thank you all for joining us for this wonderful episode today, and we hope to see you all next time.
That's right. Take care, everybody.
See yous.